There is a moment just before dawn on the shortest day of the year when the hills of the Boyne Valley in County Meath seem to hold their breath. Frost silvers the grass, mist gathers in the low hollows where the river turns. The sky above the mound is the colour of old iron, and somewhere in the darkness beneath the earth, a chamber that has waited 5,200 years is waiting still. Above the entrance to this mound, cut through the massive curbstones and set into the passage roof, there is a small rectangular opening. It looks, to the untrained eye, like an accident of construction, a gap left by careless hands. It is nothing of the kind. It is one of the most precisely engineered pieces of stonework in the ancient world. And on this morning, if the clouds relent, if the horizon burns clean, a pencil-thin blade of sunlight will slide through that aperture, travel 19 metres down a passage of standing stones and strike a triple spiral carving in the innermost chamber. It will hold there, brightening, widening, illuminating a space that has otherwise never known the sun. And then, after 17 minutes, it will withdraw. The chamber will fall back into the dark it has kept for another year. 17 minutes, not a day, not an hour, 17 minutes. A window so narrow that even the men who built it must have understood they were making an instrument, not a monument. Something calibrated, something exact. The question is how, and the question is why. And the question, threaded through every stone in every field on every continent we are about to visit, is this: how much did they know, and how long ago did they know it? There are places on this planet where the ground remembers, where the earth itself seems to have been shaped into a language, and the letters of that language are boulders, ridges, alignments, apertures, avenues of upright stone leading toward horizons where a specific star rose on a specific morning several thousand years before writing existed. There are hilltops in Anatolia carved with what appear to be sky maps 11 millennia old. There are stone circles in the Egyptian Sahara whose sightlines point towards stars that have long since drifted from their marked positions. There are geoglyphs raked into the coastal deserts of Peru whose meaning still resists the patient tools of modern science. And there is a passage tomb in Ireland, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, whose only purpose seems to have been to catch a single beam of winter sunlight and hold it, for 17 minutes, against a spiral cut into rock. Stay with us. What follows is a slow, careful journey across a planet of pointing stones, and toward a mystery that will not be dismissed. Newgrange stands on a low ridge overlooking a bend in the River Boyne, some 50 kilometres north of Dublin. From a distance it appears almost gentle, a great white-fronted hill wrapped with quartz and studded with rounded fieldstones, its curved curb encircling a mound that seems to have grown out of the land rather than having been imposed upon it. There are farms in the middle distance, hedgerows, the occasional slow line of cattle. It is a landscape that gives no obvious clue that beneath its softened contours lies an instrument of astronomical precision, built when much of Europe was still forest, when the wheel was a novelty, when the great cities of Mesopotamia were only beginning to rise. At first glance the visitor sees only a burial mound, and in a sense that is what it is. Bone fragments, cremated remains, the residue of ceremony. All have been recovered from the interior. Mainstream archaeology has long classified Newgrange, alongside its sister mounds at Noath and Doath, as a Neolithic passage tomb, a funerary monument of the 4th millennium before the Common Era. That description is accurate, and it is also almost comically insufficient. It is like describing a cathedral as a room, because Newgrange is not merely a place where the dead were laid. It is a place where the sky was invited in. The entrance faces southeast, toward the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the winter solstice. Above the doorway, cut into the roofing slabs, sits the feature that has made this mound world famous, a narrow rectangular slit, roughly the width of a hand, set several feet above the passage floor. Archaeologists call it the roof box. It looks at rest like nothing at all, a shadowed aperture in a wall of stone, but it is the aperture that changes everything. For most of the year, the roof box does nothing. Sun rises, sun sets, seasons wheel. The chamber remains sealed in its darkness. Then, in the days on either side of the winter solstice, that is the 21st of December, the shortest day, the pivot of the northern year, the geometry of the Earth's tilt aligns with the geometry of the passage. The rising sun clears the far horizon at just the correct angle. its light spears through the roof box, threads down the corridor between the standing stones, and lands, as if placed by hand, on the back wall of the inner chamber. The passage itself is 19 metres long. That is not a trivial distance. It is roughly the length of a modern city bus. To send a beam of sunlight down that length and have it strike a predetermined point requires that every stone lining the passage be positioned to permit its passage, that the floor be laid at a precise gradient, that the roof box be cut at the exact altitude and azimuth to catch the winter sun and no other. Miscalculate by a degree, and the light dies in the mouth of the passage. Miscalculate by a hair of a degree over 19 metres, and it lands in the wrong place, or fails to land at all. The builders did not miscalculate. The chamber into which the light spills is cruciform, 3 recessed alcoves branching from a central floor beneath a corbelled roof that rises some 6 metres overhead. A vaulted ceiling made of overlapping slabs so cunningly balanced that it has not leaked in 5,200 years, and on the stones of that chamber, carved with tools of flint and quartz, are spirals. Single spirals, double spirals, and most famously a triple spiral. 3 coiled forms interlocking into a single motif, a symbol found nowhere else in the world quite as it is found here. When the solstice beam reaches its full extension, it falls, or is said to fall, or falls approximately upon that triple spiral, and the room, dark for 364 mornings a year, briefly becomes an illuminated theatre of light and shadow, for 17 minutes. Then the earth turns, the angle drifts, the beam narrows, retreats, dissolves, and the chamber closes again upon its darkness. It is impossible to stand at Newgrange and not feel the enormity of what one is looking at. The people who raised this mound did not have iron. They did not have writing. They did not have wheeled carts, so far as we can tell, in any significant quantity. They moved the great curbstones, some weighing several tons, from quarries kilometres away, by means we can only guess at, rollers of oak, ropes of woven hide, the coordinated labour of what must have been an entire regional population. They shaped the corbelled roof so precisely that no keystone was required. They carved decoration into stones that would afterwards be turned inward, hidden, invisible to human eyes, as though the stones themselves were the intended audience. And over the top of all this they built a solar clock accurate to within a few days over 5¼ millennia. For most of the intervening centuries no one knew. The mound stood on its hill. Cattle grazed on its flanks. Local farmers passed it on the way to market. There were stories, of course. There are always stories in Ireland. About fairy mounds, about the cedar, about lights and voices heard on certain nights of the year. Folklore held that the sun on a particular winter morning entered the hill. Antiquarians dismissed such tales as peasant fancy. Even after the mound was rediscovered in the 17th century, when a landowner's men, quarrying stone, broke into the passage and stumbled out with reports of a strange corbelled chamber, no one connected the site to the sky. It was a curiosity, a tomb, a pile of rock with unusual carvings. That was all. Then came Michael J. O'Kelly. Professor Michael O'Kelly of University College Cork began systematic excavation of Newgrange in 1962. He would work at the site for 13 years, an act of scholarly patience so extended that it has few parallels in the field. He and his wife, Claire, cleared the passage, catalogued the carvings, studied the curb, documented the quartz that had once faced the mound's exterior wall, and, in the course of that work, he heard the local stories, the persistent, quiet insistence of the people who lived nearby that at some point in midwinter, the sun found its way inside. O'Kelly was a rigorous man, trained in the sceptical traditions of mid-20th century archaeology. But he was curious, and so, on the morning of the 21st of December 1967, he did what no scholar had apparently ever thought to do. He went to Newgrange alone before dawn, and he stepped into the chamber. He crouched in the darkness at the back wall. He waited, and he watched. What he saw he later described in words that read, even now, like the account of a witness struck partly speechless. The first sign was a pale yellow line on the floor at the far end of the passage. It grew, it widened, it advanced. Light climbed the passage as if it were being poured, and then, in his own account, it lit up everything as it came, until the whole chamber, the side recesses, the floor and the roof 6 meters above, were all clearly illuminated. He was standing inside a machine, and the machine had just been switched on a schedule set 5,200 years before. He was not, in that moment, watching an accident. He knew that. Whatever else might be argued about Newgrange, whatever debates might follow about the precise degree of intentionality behind this or that stone, that morning removed one possibility from the field: coincidence. A shaft of light does not travel 19 meters down a stone passage through a purpose-cut aperture to illuminate a specific carving in a specific room for a specific window of minutes at a specific point in the astronomical year, by chance. The mound had been built to do this. The mound had been built for nothing else. There are honest complications, and they must be acknowledged. The roof box, as O'Kelly found it, had partially collapsed and required reconstruction. Some skeptics have asked reasonably how confident we can be that the reconstructed aperture reflects the exact original geometry. The alignment is not knife-sharp to a single instant, but distributed across several days on either side of the solstice. Access to the chamber during the solstice window is now determined by an annual public lottery, a fact of modern administration that reminds us how completely the mystery of Newgrange has moved from folklore to global reverence in the space of a single lifetime. None of these caveats dislodges the central observation. The alignment is real. The light does enter. The chamber does fill. And whatever quibbles remain about millimeters, no reasonable interpretation now denies that Neolithic hands built the mound to catch the winter sun. Consider, for a moment, the implications. 5,200 years ago, on a low ridge in what is now Ireland, a community of Stone Age farmers gathered enough labour, engineering knowledge, and long-term astronomical observation to build a solar observatory disguised as a tomb. To identify the solstice, they must have watched the sun's rising point for years, decades perhaps, generation to generation. To fix its extreme southerly position, they needed a horizon reference, a memory tradition, an intergenerational commitment to a single measurement. To orient a passage to that point, they needed practical geometry. To engineer a roof box that would deliver the beam not into the wall, but through the wall required an understanding of angles that would not be formalized in the written record for another 2,000 years. And they built it, all of it, without leaving behind a single line of writing to tell us why. And here is where Newgrange stops being an Irish curiosity and becomes something else, because Newgrange is not alone. Newgrange is not even unusual. Pull the camera back. Rise, in the imagination, above the Boyne Valley, above the low green fields of Meath, up through the cloud layer, up to the height from which the whole northern hemisphere unrolls below, and then higher still, until the planet itself is a single blue and white sphere turning slowly beneath you. And now, in the mind's eye, mark every place on that turning surface where a human hand, working before the invention of writing, arranged stones in a manner that appears to encode the movement of the sky. You will find yourself very quickly running out of space to place the marks. In the western desert of Egypt, some 800 kilometers south of Cairo, on the floor of what was once a seasonal lake, there stands a circle of small upright stones and a scatter of larger megaliths, whose alignments have been proposed to point toward the risings of certain stars, Sirius, Arcturus, Alpha Centauri, in configurations that would have been correct several thousand years earlier than the earliest written astronomy anywhere on Earth. The site is called Nabta Playa. Radiocarbon dates for its associated cultural layers stretch back into the 7th millennium before the Common Era, that is, at the outside, some 4,000 or 5,000 years before the Babylonian tablets that our textbooks conventionally cite as the beginning of formal astronomical record-keeping. Nabta Playa is older than the pyramids. It is older than Newgrange, and it appears, on the evidence available, to have been an instrument for tracking stars. In southern Peru, across the coastal desert between the Nazca and Palpa valleys, the ground itself has been carved. Vast geoglyphs, straight lines running for kilometers, spirals, trapezoids, and the famous figurative drawings of hummingbird, monkey, spider, condor cover a plateau so arid and so windless that the marks, though shallow, have persisted for 2,000 years. Some researchers, following the extraordinary lifetime of fieldwork by Maria Reich, have argued that these lines encode astronomical alignments, risings and settings of significant stars, the arc of the Pleiades, the movement of the sun across the seasons. Others have argued they are ritual pathways or offerings or maps of underground water. The debate is not resolved, but it is impossible to walk those lines or to see them from the air and not sense that something is being said in a language whose grammar has been forgotten. In Cambodia, in the humid green heart of Southeast Asia, the immense sandstone temple of Angkor Wat rises above its moat in 5 concentric towers modelled in the traditional interpretation on Mount Meru, the cosmic axis of Hindu cosmology. It is a 12th century monument, comparatively young by the standards of what we're discussing, and yet some researchers, examining the plan of the wider Angkor complex, have proposed that its layout, seen from above, mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared in the sky above the site in that same century. The claim is contested. Mainstream archaeologists have preferred cosmological rather than astronomical readings, but the possibility once raised is difficult to unsee. A temple complex laid out as a mirror of a specific portion of sky at a specific historical moment. And in Turkey, on a windswept ridge in the southeast of the country, overlooking the plains where the Tigris and the Euphrates rise, there is a site that has forced almost everyone who studies the human past to revise their sense of what our species was doing 11,000 years ago. It is called Göbekli Tepe. Its T-shaped megalithic pillars, some standing over 5 meters high, are carved with animals, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, boars, in bas-relief so confident and so stylized that they defy every prior assumption about the artistic capacity of hunter-gatherer peoples. Some researchers have proposed that certain of these carvings, in particular a panel on what is called the vulture stone, are not zoological but astronomical. Pictorial star maps encoding constellations, celestial events, catastrophes remembered from a distant past. The site's principal excavators, sensibly, have preferred more restrained ritualistic interpretations, but the pillars are there, and their orientations and the sightlines between them and the deliberate way that certain enclosures point outward to the horizon have driven independent researchers into their spreadsheets and their planetarium software with a fervour that will not be quieted. None of this even begins to exhaust the catalogue. There are more than 1,000 documented archaeoastronomical sites currently indexed in the global databases, maintained by scholars working in the field, most notably by the British archaeoastronomer Clive Ruggles, whose patient career has done more than perhaps anyone else's to bring rigour to a discipline previously torn between advocacy and dismissal. Stone rows in Brittany, medicine wheels on the northern plains of North America, sun daggers in the American Southwest, alignments at Karnak, alignments at Chichen Itzá, alignments in the highlands of Bolivia and the coastal steppe of Mongolia and the moorlands of the Outer Hebrides. There is scarcely an inhabited continent whose prehistory does not include stones that appear to point at something in the sky. And the sky, again and again, appears to point back. Here is the puzzle in its bluntest form. Formal astronomy, astronomy as a written, systematic, cumulative discipline, is conventionally traced to Babylonian records from roughly the first millennium before the Common Era. That gives us generously about 3,000 years of documented astronomy. The Greeks build on the Babylonians, the Arab world builds on the Greeks, Europe builds on the Arab world. From that written thread we get Ptolemy, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton and everything that follows. A neat story, a clean lineage. But Newgrange is 5,200 years old. Nabta Playa is older still. Göbekli Tepe is nearly 11,000 years old. If the alignments hold, and at Newgrange at least the alignment demonstrably holds, then human beings were tracking the sky and encoding what they tracked into monumental stone for at least 6,000 years before the moment we conventionally call the beginning of astronomy. 6,000 years. That is not a footnote. That is longer than the entire span of recorded history since the Babylonians. It suggests that our neat lineage from Mesopotamia to Newton is not the beginning of a discipline but its second act. It suggests that the first act happened in the dark before writing, and that the only records we have of it are the ones cut into stone. Could it be that the timeline of human knowledge is simply wrong? Could it be that what we call the invention of astronomy is only its rediscovery, its recovery in a written form of a body of observation that had already been carried, generation after generation, in the memory of peoples whose names we do not know, whose languages we cannot reconstruct, whose faces we will never see? The stones do not tell us. The stones only point. To ask these questions honestly, one must confront the fact that the discipline devoted to asking them has, for most of its existence, dared not speak its own name. Archaeoastronomy, the study of the astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments, is not a comfortable field. It sits between astronomy and archaeology, and it has, for the greater part of the last century, been treated by both parent disciplines as a slightly disreputable child. Its practitioners have been mocked, its findings have been attacked, its early advocates have more than once been driven out of the mainstream of respectable scholarship and into a wilderness where their work has been mingled, sometimes against their will, with the ravings of frank pseudoscience. That the field exists at all today, with a global database, with peer-reviewed journals, with careful methodologies for statistical evaluation of alignment claims, is a small miracle. It exists because certain individuals refused, over a period of more than a century, to stop pointing at the stones. The story of that struggle begins, in its modern form, on a September morning in 1963, when an American astronomer named Gerald Hawkins published a paper in the journal Nature, suggesting that Stonehenge was, in effect, a computer. Hawkins had fed the coordinates of 165 site features into an IBM 7290 mainframe, a machine that, in 1963, was among the most powerful computational instruments on the planet, and had asked it to test whether the alignments between those features corresponded at statistically significant frequencies to the rising and setting positions of the Sun and Moon at their major extremes. The machine reported that they did. Hawkins, following up with a book 2 years later titled Stonehenge Decoded, argued that the Great Henge on Salisbury Plain was not merely aligned to the solstice, but was an entire eclipse-predicting device, a Neolithic instrument capable, in the hands of its priests, of anticipating the darkening of the moon and the sun. The reaction from the archaeological establishment was volcanic. Jacquetta Hawkes, one of the most eloquent voices in mid-century British archaeology, dismissed the enterprise with a remark that has since become famous. "Every age," she said, "gets the Stonehenge it deserves, or the Stonehenge it desires." The implication was clear. Hawkins was projecting onto the ancient monument the preoccupations of his own computational age. He was seeing, in the pattern of stones, a mirror of his own mainframe. Richard Atkinson, the archaeologist who had led major excavations at the site in the preceding decades, went further, publishing a devastating critique in which he argued that Hawkins had allowed himself margins of error of up to 2 degrees, that certain of his sight lines relied not on intentional features but on natural depressions in the horizon, and that with sufficient tolerance for imprecision, one could find statistically significant alignments in the arrangement of practically anything. The rebuke was severe. It was not, on its own merits, entirely unfair. Hawkins had, in his enthusiasm, overreached. His margins were generous, his claims were bold, and yet the ferocity of the response was itself telling, because it echoed, with uncanny fidelity, a controversy from 60 years earlier. In the closing years of the 19th century, the English astronomer Sir Norman Lockyer, the founder of the journal Nature, the discoverer from spectroscopic evidence of the element helium, turned his attention to the ancient temples of Egypt. Lockyer had noticed that the axes of certain temples appeared to be oriented toward the rising or setting points of specific stars. He proposed that the temples had been deliberately aligned to those stars, and that, over the centuries, as precession slowly shifted the positions of the stars in the sky, the temples had been reoriented or rebuilt to maintain the alignment. From this, he argued that Egyptian priesthoods had possessed a systematic astronomical tradition of considerable antiquity. The response from Egyptologists of his own day was withering. Lockyer was an outsider. He was an astronomer, meddling in a field he did not understand. His alignments, critics said, were coincidences. His stars were chosen after the fact to fit the temples. His whole enterprise smacked of an astronomer's arrogance, imposing celestial mathematics on a culture whose religious architecture had, obviously, been shaped by ritual and by myth, not by measurement. And so, twice within the space of a single century, the same drama had played out. An astronomer, armed with data, had pointed at a great ancient monument and said, "This is aligned to the sky." An archaeologist, defending the ritual and cultural readings that were their proper professional territory, had said, "No, the alignment is illusion. The pattern is projection. Every age gets the past it desires. The stones are not speaking. You are speaking and calling it stone. It is possible that both sides, in their turn, were partly right, and it is possible too that we are only now, with better data, with better methods, with a genuinely global comparative database of thousands of sites, beginning to be able to tell where the alignment ends and the projection begins. That is the ground on which the rest of our journey will be walked. It will require patience. It will require skepticism. It will require, above all, a willingness to hold in the mind at the same time two apparently incompatible ideas: that our ancestors were not the primitives we sometimes imagine them to have been, and that we are not always the objective observers we believe ourselves to be. The stones are still standing. The winter sun still enters the passage at Newgrange for 17 minutes once a year. Somewhere in the darkness of a chamber older than writing, a beam of light is falling even now on a spiral cut into rock. The question is what it means, and to begin answering we must travel east and back through 6,000 years, to a hill in Turkey where the whole story appears to begin. The hill lies in the parched uplands of southeastern Anatolia, a few kilometres from the city of Şanlıurfa, in a country that has held more layers of civilization than almost any other patch of ground on Earth. From a distance it looks like nothing much. A low limestone ridge in a landscape of low limestone ridges, its slopes worn smooth by wind and by the trampling of goats, its summit crowned by a solitary mulberry tree that local people, for as long as anyone could remember, had used as a shady meeting place. The Kurdish name for the rise was Giremirazan, the Wish Hill. In Turkish it had come to be called Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill, for the swelling curve of its silhouette against the sky. Farmers ploughed its lower slopes, shepherds moved their flocks across its shoulders, children scrambled over its outcrops in search of birds' nests, and for as long as anyone had looked at it, no one had thought it anything more than a hill. There had in fact been a brief encounter with the place decades earlier. A joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University had passed across the ridge in the 1960s, noting the presence of scattered flints, cataloguing the site as a probable medieval cemetery, and moving on. The limestone slabs protruding from the ground here and there were logged as the broken tops of Byzantine grave markers. The team was not looking for anything older. The Neolithic, in the received wisdom of the day, could not possibly have produced monumental architecture. Monumental architecture required kings, priests, granaries, cities, and none of these things had existed in the region at the depth of time in question. And so the flints were bagged, the slabs were noted, the report was filed, and the hill returned to its long silence beneath the mulberry tree. It waited nearly 30 years. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had spent much of his career working on Neolithic sites in southeastern Turkey, and had developed an intuition for the way that early stone monuments tended to reveal themselves in the landscape, came across the old Chicago report and decided, almost on a hunch, that the classification deserved a second look. He drove out to the ridge. He walked its slopes. He looked at the slabs the earlier team had dismissed as grave markers, and he saw immediately that they were not grave markers. They were the tops of something very much larger, buried in the hillside beneath his feet. And they were far, far too old to be anything the textbooks had prepared him to find. The excavations began in 1995, a joint project of the German Archaeological Institute and the Şanlıurfa Museum, and from almost the first season the site began to overturn its own expectations. What emerged from the earth, as trench after trench was carefully opened, was a landscape of enormous T-shaped stone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall, some weighing well in excess of 10 tons, arranged in circular and oval enclosures dug into the bedrock of the ridge. The pillars had been quarried from the limestone plateau nearby and dragged somehow into position. They had been set upright with astonishing precision, their long axes carefully oriented, their flat faces turned to face the centre of the enclosures they helped to form. And they had been carved. Along their sides ran reliefs of foxes with bared teeth, of vultures with outstretched wings, of scorpions poised in mid-strike, of snakes coiled in tight spirals, of aurochs and wild boar and cranes, and, threaded among the animals, a scattering of abstract symbols, H-shapes, crescents, circles, and pictograms whose meanings no one could confidently guess. The T-shape of the pillars themselves, it soon became clear, was not a design accident. It was a stylized human form. The horizontal cap was a head, the vertical shaft a body. On some of the pillars, arms were carved along the sides, hands folded across the belly, belts and loincloths rendered in low relief. These were not architectural columns. They were people, rendered in stone at the scale of giants. And then came the dates, the organic material trapped in the fill that had, at some ancient moment, been used to bury the enclosures, flakes of charcoal, fragments of bone, traces of plant remains, was submitted for radiocarbon analysis, and the numbers that came back were, quite simply, not the numbers anyone had expected. The oldest layers of construction at Göbekli Tepe were dating to somewhere around 9600 BCE. Not late Neolithic, not middle Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic. The very earliest phase, the moment at which human beings in this part of the world were still, according to every reconstruction the discipline had painstakingly built, subsistence hunter-gatherers. The site had been under active use in various forms, from that date down to something like the 82nd century BCE, when it was, deliberately and comprehensively, filled in with rubble and abandoned. Which meant, when the arithmetic was done, that the construction of Göbekli Tepe predated Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predated the pyramids of Egypt by more than 7,000. It predated the invention of writing by 5,000. It predated pottery in the region by 1,000 years or more. It predated the domestication of the plants and animals on which every subsequent civilization would rest. Think for a moment about what that means. Think about the world in which these pillars were raised. There were no cities. There were no villages of any real permanence so far as anyone can tell. There were no kings, no priests, no scribes, no clay tablets, no ledgers, no fields under cultivation, no herds under control. Bread, in the sense we understand it, did not yet exist. The wheel would not be invented for another 6,000 years. The people who came to this ridge and cut these pillars from the surrounding limestone lived by hunting gazelle and wild ass, by trapping birds, by gathering nuts and seeds and wild grains from the hills. They wore the skins of the animals they killed. They slept, most likely, in seasonal camps of brushwood and hide, and somehow, at some moment, we cannot yet name some number of them, enough to move stones weighing many tons across kilometres of open country, gathered together on this particular hill and set out to build something on a scale that no human beings, so far as we know, had ever built before. There was at the bottom of the quarry from which the pillars were cut an unfinished monolith. The excavators found it lying where it had been abandoned, its base still fused to the bedrock, its shaft rough-hewn but recognisable. Estimates of its weight vary. Some place it at 50 tons. However one measures it, it is a stone of a size that would have required the coordinated effort of many hundreds of people to detach, to shape, and to move. And it was one stone among many. Enclosure after enclosure lay buried in the ridge, layer beneath layer, and geophysical surveys, ground-penetrating radar sweeping the areas that have not yet been excavated, have suggested that only a small fraction of the site has so far been uncovered. Beneath the mulberry tree, beneath the goat tracks, beneath the long silence of the hill, are more circles, more pillars, more faces, more carvings. The paradigm, when it broke completely. For most of the 20th century, the received story of human civilization had run in a particular direction. First, at some moment in the closing millennia of the last ice age, human beings had begun, in scattered places, to experiment with the cultivation of plants and the herding of animals. Agriculture, once established, had produced surpluses. Surpluses had produced settled populations. Settled populations had produced hierarchies, specialist priesthoods. Priesthoods had produced monumental religious architecture. In that order, that was the ladder up which civilization was supposed to have climbed. Göbekli Tepe kicked the ladder over. Here was monumental religious architecture, if that is even the right word for it, thousands of years before the surpluses were in place to fund it, before the hierarchies were in place to organise it, before the settlements were in place to sustain it. Klaus Schmidt would come to argue, in a phrase that has since been repeated so often it risks losing its edge, that the temple came first and the city followed. That it was not agriculture that gave birth to religion, but religion, or something like religion, some vast collective imaginative project, that gave birth to agriculture. That the effort of feeding the work crews who came to the hill to raise the pillars may itself have been the pressure that pushed the hunter-gatherers of the region toward the sustained cultivation of wild grasses. The very hillsides around Göbekli Tepe, geneticists have shown, are among the ancestral homelands of domesticated wheat. Whether Schmidt's inversion of the classical sequence will prove exactly right, in every detail, remains a matter of vigorous debate. What is no longer in serious dispute is that the sequence, as it was taught for most of the 20th century, was wrong. Hunter-gatherers, it turns out, were capable of monumental construction. They were capable of long-range coordination. They were capable of symbolic thought of extraordinary complexity. They were capable, we now must consider, of things we had told ourselves they could not do. And if that is true, then a great many other assumptions built upon the old sequence. Assumptions about the intellectual capacity of pre-agricultural peoples, about the origins of astronomy, about the antiquity of the ideas we have long thought recent, must at the very least be held more loosely than before. Standing on the ridge today, one feels the weight of that revision physically. The wind comes off the plain in dry gusts, carrying the smell of dust and time. Below, the enclosures lie open under their protective canopy, the pillars ringed by walkways, their carved faces turned to the light for the first time in 11 millennia. In the older circles, the pillars are larger, the carvings more elaborate, the workmanship more assured. In the later phases, as the centuries progressed, the pillars grow smaller, the enclosures more cramped, the reliefs cruder. The site, whatever else it was, seems to have declined. The people who built it in their earliest and most confident hour made their greatest work first, and then, over the course of centuries, made lesser and lesser versions of it, until at last, around 8200 BCE, they gathered themselves for a final act. They filled the enclosures in, deliberately, painstakingly. Layer by layer, with rubble and soil and the discarded bones of feasts, they covered the pillars over, sealed the circles beneath the hill and walked away. The reason for the burial is not known. Some have suggested a ritual closure, a formal termination of the sacred function of the place. Others have suggested that the fill was intended to preserve the enclosures for a future they perhaps expected, and perhaps did not. Whatever the intent, the result was that Göbekli Tepe was not so much abandoned as entombed. Its pillars still standing where their builders had set them, its carvings still legible, its silence intact, waiting beneath the mulberry tree for the moment when a German archaeologist, following a hunch, would drive out from the city and begin to open the ground. Of all the enclosures so far excavated, of all the pillars so far uncovered, one has drawn a disproportionate share of attention. It stands within the enclosure known simply as Enclosure D, one of the largest and most fully preserved of the older circles, and in the site catalogue it is designated Pillar 43. Among the wider public it has come to be known as the Vulture Stone. It is a limestone slab a little under 2 meters wide set into the perimeter wall of its enclosure, its outer face turned toward the interior of the circle so that its carvings can be seen by anyone standing at the centre. The carvings themselves are, even by the extraordinary standards of the site, arresting. Across the upper portion of the pillar a great bird spreads its wings. Long feathers, hooked beak, hunched shoulders. A vulture, unmistakable in silhouette, holding what appears to be a small round object like a ball or a disc balanced on the tip of one outstretched wing. Beneath the vulture, other creatures crowd the surface. A scorpion, its tail curled and ready. A snake, or possibly several. A wading bird, its long legs and beak carefully rendered. A collection of smaller quadrupeds, harder to identify. And at the base of the pillar, isolated and unmistakable in its meaning, a headless human figure with what has been variously described as an erect posture, or the posture of a body in mid-fall, the neck ending in a clean, unambiguous absence where a head ought to be. For decades, the pillar has been read within the framework the site's excavators have consistently preferred, as a work of religious and mythological symbolism tied to what appear to be widespread Neolithic themes of death, ancestral cult, and the ambiguous relationship between human beings and the animals of the surrounding world. Vultures, in the funerary practices of several later Anatolian cultures, are associated with the exposure of the dead and the release of the soul. Scorpions and snakes recur throughout Near Eastern iconography as guardians of thresholds. The headless figure has been read as a reference to the practice, well attested in the wider pre-pottery Neolithic world, of separating skulls from bodies as part of ancestor veneration. In this reading, Pillar 43 is a rich and evocative composition, but it is a composition of symbols drawn from ritual and myth. It is a statement about death and about the passage of the soul, and about the fearful and reverential relationship of the living to the forces that ended the lives of the dead. It is, on this reading, precisely the kind of thing one might expect a Neolithic community with a developed funerary imagination to have made. In 2017, however, a paper appeared in an academic journal that took the pillar in an entirely different direction. Its authors were Martin Sweatman, a chemical engineer at the University of Edinburgh, and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, a colleague from the same institution. They had approached the vulture stone not as archaeologists or as students of Neolithic religion, but as scientists interested in a specific hypothesis: that the animal reliefs at Göbekli Tepe were not merely symbolic creatures, but astronomical figures, representations of constellations as those constellations had appeared in the sky above the site at a very particular moment in the distant past. Using modern astronomical software to reverse the effects of precession and simulate the appearance of the night sky over southeastern Anatolia across the millennia, they proposed that the animals on Pillar 43 could be matched one by one to the star patterns of what would later become the Greco-Babylonian zodiac. The vulture, they argued, corresponded to Sagittarius. The scorpion corresponded to Scorpius. Other figures matched Libra and neighbouring groupings, and when the whole composition was read as a single sky view, the configuration of constellations depicted on the pillar corresponded, they claimed, to the sky as it would have appeared over Göbekli Tepe at a specific date, roughly 10,050 BCE, with a margin of error of a few centuries on either side. That date is not a random point in prehistory. It falls, with tantalizing precision, within the window in which climatologists and geologists have identified the onset of a sudden and catastrophic cooling event known as the Younger Dryas. Just as the world was emerging from the last great glaciation, just as ice sheets were retreating and temperatures were climbing, something happened. Global temperatures plunged. Glaciers, in places, advanced again. Ecosystems were disrupted. Human populations across large regions of the northern hemisphere appear to have suffered severe stress. Megafauna went extinct across the Americas at almost precisely this moment. And the cause of the Younger Dryas, long a matter of scientific debate, has, in recent years, become the subject of a controversial hypothesis suggesting that a fragmenting comet, striking or exploding above the northern ice sheets, may have triggered the abrupt collapse. It is a hypothesis fiercely disputed within the earth sciences, but it exists. And Sweatman and Tsikritsis proposed that the headless man at the base of Pillar 43, together with the specific configuration of the constellations above him, represented an encoded memory of that catastrophe, a date-stamped record carved in limestone of the day the sky fell. The reaction from the archaeological community was swift and largely hostile. Excavators at the site and specialists in the iconography of the pre-pottery Neolithic pointed out a series of problems. The identification of the reliefs with specific constellations relied, they argued, on the retrospective imposition of a much later Greco-Babylonian sky map onto animals whose meanings, in their own Neolithic context, were almost certainly quite different. The site's enclosures, the critics noted, appear to have been roofed, which would have made observation of the sky through the enclosures themselves impossible. The pillars had been modified, recarved, and even moved during the long life of the site, complicating any attempt to read them as a single, frozen moment. And the readings offered for other elements of the composition, the ball on the vulture's wing as the sun at solstice, the headless figure as the dead of the Younger Dryas, required interpretive leaps that many working archaeologists were not prepared to make. And yet, the debate that Sweatman and Tsikritsis initiated has not gone away. Other researchers have taken up the question. Refinements and rebuttals have circulated. The core claim, that the animals of Göbekli Tepe are, at least in part, celestial figures rather than merely earthly ones, has entered the wider conversation about the site and refuses to leave it. What remains, once the argument has been aired, is the pillar itself still standing where its makers set it, with its vulture and its scorpion and its silent, headless man. Whether it is a star chart, whether it is a cenotaph, whether it is a myth carved in stone, whether it is all three at once, no one, at present, can say with certainty. The pillar keeps its counsel. It is one of the oldest complex compositions ever made by human hands, and we do not know what it means. What we can say, and this is where the wider journey of our story begins to gather itself, is that the possibility raised by Pillar 43, the possibility that the people of the earliest Neolithic were watching the sky with an attentiveness and a technical seriousness we have not credited them with, does not stand alone. It resonates uncannily with what has been proposed at another site on another continent, dating to a period a great deal closer to our own, but still deep in the prehistoric past. To follow that resonance, we must travel south and west, across the Taurus Mountains, down through the Levant, across the Sinai and the Nile, and out into the empty, sun-hammered wilderness of the Egyptian Western Desert, to a place whose name means, in the local Arabic, the plain of the acacia trees. Nabta Playa lies more than 800 kilometers south of Cairo, close to the Sudanese border, in a landscape that is today one of the driest and most inhospitable on earth. There is no water, there is almost no vegetation, there is no permanent human presence. The temperature by day can climb past 50 degrees Celsius. The nights are cold and star-glittering. The wind lifts sand in dry sheets and sends it hissing across the pans. It is, at first encounter, a landscape that seems to have nothing to do with the deep history of civilization. It is a place that appears to have been forgotten by everything except geology. And yet, 10,000 years ago, it was not like this at all. The great climatic shift known as the African humid period had drawn the summer monsoons northward, greening what is now the Sahara, filling shallow basins with seasonal lakes, drawing herds of cattle and their human keepers into a rolling savanna of grasses and scattered trees. Nabta Playa itself was one such basin, a broad depression in the desert floor that, in the wet season, held a lake several kilometers across. Around its shores gathered, generation after generation, nomadic cattle-herding peoples whose lives were tied to the arrival and departure of the summer rains. It was into this vanished world that, in 1974, an American archaeologist named Fred Wendorf led an expedition, having been alerted to a scatter of prehistoric material eroding from the surface of the playa. What Wendorf and his team discovered, over the course of several seasons of survey and excavation, was that Nabta Playa had been not merely a seasonal camping ground, but a place of sustained and elaborate ritual construction. There were burial mounds, there were sacrificial pits containing the remains of young cattle, carefully arranged, their bones dating back to the 6th millennium BCE. There were arrangements of large stone slabs, some of them dragged from outcrops kilometers away, set upright or carefully laid in configurations that resisted casual explanation. And there was, most remarkably, a small circle of stones, no more than about 4 meters across, its uprights modest in comparison with the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, that appeared to have been laid out with unusual care, its inner uprights arranged so as to create sight lines through the ring in specific directions. The circle came to be known as the calendar circle, and its dating placed its construction at somewhere around 5000 BCE, a full millennium before the first stones were raised on Salisbury Plain. The astronomical analysis of the site began in earnest some years later, with the work of an American astrophysicist named Thomas Brophy, who took the surveyed positions of the stones and ran them against the reconstructed sky above the playa across the relevant range of millennia. His conclusions were striking. The inner stones of the calendar circle, he proposed, defined a line of sight toward the point on the horizon at which the sun rose on the summer solstice, the very moment at which, in this region, the monsoon rains were expected to begin, and at which the arrival of the lake and the life it brought was celebrated. That reading, in a modest form, was accepted even by conservative scholars of the site. A solstitial marker of some kind seemed reasonable, given the profound economic and ritual importance of the rains. But Brophy went further. He proposed that a set of nearby standing stones, arranged in what appeared to be otherwise inexplicable configurations across the plain, corresponded to the positions of the 3 stars of Orion's belt, as they had appeared above the horizon at Nabta Playa around 6400 BCE. And he proposed, more radically still, that another set of stones corresponded to the positions of those same stars as they had appeared thousands of years earlier, at a date he calculated to have fallen around 16500 BCE, deep in the last ice age, long before any human being was known to have settled at the site. The difference between the two positions was not arbitrary. It was the difference produced by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the phenomenon known to modern astronomy as the precession of the equinoxes, which over the course of roughly 26,000 years causes the position of the stars against the horizon at any given latitude to drift and eventually return. If Brophy was right, if the 2 sets of stones did indeed correspond to the 2 positions of Orion's belt at 2 widely separated moments in the deep past, then the people who had raised those stones had not merely observed the current sky, They had known something or had inherited something about how the sky had looked in a distant era before their own. They had in some manner tracked the wobble. It is a claim that has, for reasonable cause, made most archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Precession is not something one notices in a lifetime. It is not something one notices in 10 lifetimes. Its effect on the horizon is measured in fractions of a degree per century, a drift so slow that even the Greeks, when Hipparchus first described it in the 2nd century BCE, had to compare star catalogues separated by hundreds of years to detect the shift. The suggestion that a community of pastoralists in the Egyptian desert, 5,000 years before Hipparchus, had somehow encoded not only the current position of Orion's belt, but its position some 10,000 years further back into the past, a position no living observer could have witnessed, and no oral tradition can plausibly be shown to have transmitted, is a suggestion that lifts the entire matter into the realm of the extraordinary. Mainstream Egyptology, understandably, has kept its distance. The counter-arguments are familiar. The margin of error on the stone positions is wide. The correlation with Orion's belt is one of many that could be drawn if one is willing to test enough asterisms. The dates chosen may have been selected precisely because they produced the desired match. And yet, however one weighs those objections, the calendar circle itself remains. Modest, deliberate, aligned to the solstice, and older than any comparable structure in Europe. The playa keeps its stones. The stones keep their bearings. And the question of what, exactly, was being watched from that vanished shoreline continues to hover over the site, like the shimmer of a lake that is no longer there. But before we press further into that question, before we chase precession westward and eastward across the map, into the temples of Angkor and the terraces of the Andes, we must stop and take a breath, and reckon with something that the pace of a documentary tends to hide. A number has been passed several times now, almost casually. 9,600 years before the Common Era. 11,500 years ago. It's a phrase that slides easily from the tongue, the sort of phrase one skims in a textbook without pausing, because the mind, presented with any figure larger than a few thousand, tends to file it under the same drawer. Long ago. Very long ago. Longer than one can really feel. And yet, if we are to understand what these sites mean, if we are to grasp the weight of the claim that hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe carved and raised T-shaped pillars of 10 and 20 and in some cases an estimated 50 tons, and that pastoralists at Nabta Playa dragged sandstone slabs across kilometres of desert to set them in patterns that gestured at the stars, then we must attempt, however imperfectly, to make that number real. Consider what the world did not yet contain. In 9600 BCE, there was not a single city anywhere on the surface of the earth. Jericho, often cited as the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the world, was only just beginning to gather the first courses of stone that would eventually rise into its earliest walls. Uruk, in the plains of southern Mesopotamia, the place that would one day give the world its first bureaucrats and its first written accounts, would not exist for another 6,000 years. Memphis was 6,000 years away. Athens was 7,000 years away. Rome was more than 9,000 years away. There was no writing. There was no wheel. There was no plough. There was no domesticated grain being cultivated in any organised field. The animals that would one day pull carts and carry loads were, for the most part, still wild. The horse would not be tamed for another 6,000 years, and the ox was only just beginning in some regions to be considered anything other than prey. There was no such thing as pottery in most parts of the world, and where it did exist, it existed in fragments and experiments. There was no metallurgy. No copper had yet been smelted, no bronze, no iron. The only edges available to the builders of Göbekli Tepe were edges of stone, flint, chert, obsidian, struck from cores by hand, resharpened, discarded, and struck again, in a technology inherited essentially unchanged across tens of thousands of years. And yet, into this world without cities, without writing, without metal, without the plough, into this world of hunters and gatherers and small itinerant bands moving across landscapes that had, only a few thousand years earlier, been under the retreating fringe of the last great ice sheets. Into this world, someone decided that a hill in what is now southeastern Turkey required a set of great carved pillars, arranged in rings, buried into the bedrock, and adorned with the images of animals whose meaning we can only guess. and someone else, or perhaps the same tradition of someone stretching across 2,000 years of continuous activity, decided that the pillars needed to be added to and rearranged and eventually deliberately buried under fill so carefully packed that we can still, today, distinguish one enclosure from another beneath the tell. This was not the accidental accumulation of debris. This was not the improvised camp of a band passing through. This was the sustained project of a people who returned, generation after generation, to a hilltop that had no water and no obvious economic use, and who invested in it, quite literally, thousands upon thousands of hours of skilled labour. What compelled them, what organised them, what fed them while they worked. The vulture stone will not answer. The T-shaped pillars will not answer. The buried fill will not answer. But the questions do not go away. For a very long time, the standard framing of prehistory carried within it an unspoken assumption, an assumption that was almost never stated openly, because to state it openly would have been to expose how thoroughly it was an assumption rather than a finding. The assumption was, in essence, that people who lived before writing were people whose inner lives were somehow smaller than our own, that their thinking was slower, that their attention was shorter, that their capacity for planning, for symbolic thought, for abstraction, for the sustained holding of an idea across the span of a lifetime, was less developed than ours. It was rarely put in those words, but it lay beneath the vocabulary, the word primitive, the word savage, the word prehistoric itself, with its faint implication that history is where the real business of being human begins, and it lay beneath the reluctance, when confronted with sites like Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa, to accept the obvious implication of what one was seeing. The paleoanthropological evidence, patiently accumulated across the 20th century, has demolished that assumption piece by piece. The American paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall, working across a long career at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, has been among the clearest voices articulating what the fossil and archaeological record actually shows. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens, human beings with skulls indistinguishable, in every measurable respect from our own, have been in the world for well over 200,000 years. Behaviourally modern humans, humans whose archaeological traces include the manipulation of pigments, the making of ornaments, the burial of the dead with grave goods, the carving of small figurative art, and the striking of stone tools with a precision and variety that speaks of language and long apprenticeship, appear at least 70,000 years ago, and quite possibly earlier, in Africa and in the routes of dispersal that fanned out from it. What Tattersall has emphasised, again and again, in his writings and lectures, is that cognitive modernity, once it emerged, represented an entirely distinct level of complexity from anything that had come before. The mental hardware of a person born in the depths of the last ice age was, so far as we can tell, the mental hardware of a person born in a maternity ward today. The brains were the same brains, the capacities were the same capacities. The gap between what those brains could do, in principle, and what they did in fact, the gap between the potential and the accomplishment, was not a gap of biology. It was a gap of something else. That something else is what one might call, for lack of a more precise term, social scaffolding. It is not enough for the building of a Göbekli Tepe that a single mind can conceive of a T-shaped pillar and its meaning. There must also be a community that agrees the pillar matters. There must be a means by which knowledge, of quarrying, of carving, of the seasonal cycle to be marked, of the horizon points to be watched, is passed from one generation to the next without the crutch of writing. There must be a shared story that motivates the labour, a shared understanding of why one gives up a season of hunting, or of gathering wild grain, in order to drag a 10-ton block up a limestone slope. There must, in some form, be institutions, however small, however informal, however distant from what we now mean by that word, that persist across the lifetimes of individual builders. And the profoundly humbling implication of the evidence at sites like Göbekli Tepe is that all of this, the scaffolding, the story, the institutions, the multi-generational transmission, existed in some robust form among people who had none of the material apparatus we usually associate with civilization. No cities, no fields, no script, no wheel, and yet, evidently, the capacity to sustain a coherent project across 2,000 years. If one wishes to feel the strangeness of this, one has only to compare durations. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe were raised, added to, rearranged, and finally buried across a span of activity that lasted, at conservative estimates, from around 9600 BCE to around 8200 BCE. That is 14 centuries. 14 centuries of continuous engagement with a single ceremonial site. To place the number in perspective, the Roman Empire, at its longest reckoning from the founding of the Republic to the final fall of Constantinople, lasted about 20 centuries. The whole of what we call the medieval period in Europe, from the collapse of the Western Empire to the beginning of the Renaissance, occupies about 10. The interval during which Göbekli Tepe was maintained as a place of ritual concern is longer than the interval from the birth of Christ to the present day, and it was maintained not by an empire, not by a state, not by a lettered priesthood, but by successive generations of people whose subsistence was gathered by hand and hunted with stone. If that does not adjust the mind's picture of what a hunter-gatherer was, nothing will. And so, when we return to the question of astronomical alignment, when we ask whether a people of that era could have watched the sky with a sustained attention, required to place a stone exactly where it needed to be, the burden of implausibility begins, quietly, to shift. It becomes harder, not easier, to argue that they could not have done it. It becomes harder to insist that the alignments must be coincidental, that the patterns must be projections, that the ancients were incapable of the patience the modern archaeoastronomer takes for granted. Whatever else these were, they were not people whose minds were smaller than ours. They were people whose minds were ours, working in conditions we would find almost unimaginably austere, and evidently choosing to spend a considerable portion of their available effort on projects whose only apparent return was symbolic, ritual, and, as we shall see again and again, celestial. With that recalibration in place, one can return with fresh eyes to the questions raised at the very beginning of our journey, in the green damp of the Boyne Valley, where a mound of white quartz and river cobble rises out of the Irish countryside and receives once a year a needle of light through a small stone slot above its door. It is worth going back into that mound now and looking at it with the same care one would give to a machined instrument, because that, on inspection, is what Newgrange turns out to be. Consider first the vault. The chamber into which the winter solstice light travels is not a chamber excavated into rock. It is a chamber built up stone by stone from the ground in a technique known as corbelling. Each ring of the roof is set slightly inward from the ring beneath it, so that the stones lean progressively toward the centre, until at last a single capstone can close the aperture at the top. The chamber at Newgrange rises to a height of nearly 6 metres in this fashion, its stones held in place by the weight of the mound above and the geometry of their own inward tilting arrangement. There is no mortar, there is no adhesive, there is no arch, in the sense that a Roman engineer would recognise an arch, because the true arch had not yet been invented and would not be invented for thousands of years to come. And yet the vault has held. It has held for more than 5,200 years. It has held through the withdrawal of the builders, through the coming of the Celts, through the arrival of Christianity, through the Vikings and the Normans and the plantations, through centuries of Irish rain seeping down into the mound from the pasture above. And when one stands inside the chamber, in the near total dark, and looks up into the corbelled cone, one is looking at a stone ceiling that has not admitted a drop of water in more than 5 millennia. The drainage was designed. Grooves cut into the upper faces of certain roof stones channel water outward, away from the joints, so that whatever moisture penetrates the mound is deflected before it can reach the interior. The engineering is not incidental. It is the sort of engineering that a builder learns only after other, less successful attempts have failed. Somewhere in Ireland, in the centuries before Newgrange, there must have been mounds that leaked. There must have been chambers that collapsed. There must have been a tradition of trial and correction that culminated in the extraordinary competence of the Boyne Valley constructions. We have lost most of that tradition. What remains is the finished instrument. Now consider the roof box itself. It is, so far as anyone has been able to determine, unique in the whole of world megalithic architecture. Other passage tombs across Neolithic Europe show alignments of one sort or another. The great tomb of Maeshowe on Orkney is oriented toward the winter solstice sunset, and Bryn Celyn Du in Wales toward the summer solstice sunrise, and various tombs in Brittany and Iberia display comparable orientations, but none of them contains what Newgrange contains. Above the main lintel, in the outer face of the mound just where the passage begins, the builders inserted a second, smaller aperture. A rectangular slot roughly 1 metre across and just under 1 metre tall, framed by 2 horizontal slabs and floored by a carefully worked sill. It sits above the doorway, offset upward by a calculated amount, so that when the entrance itself is blocked, as it may well have been for most of the year, the roof box remains open to the sky. And it is through the roof box and not through the doorway that the solstice light enters the mound. The doorway admits people, the roof box admits the sun. It is, in the most literal sense, a specialized window built into a specialized wall, whose sole apparent function is to intercept, at a precise angle, one particular event on the eastern horizon at one particular time of year. That angle has been measured. The archaeoastronomer Frank Prendergast, working at what was then the Dublin Institute of Technology, undertook in the closing decades of the 20th century a systematic surveying campaign at Newgrange, using instruments considerably more accurate than anything available to the site's original excavators. Prendergast and his colleagues quantified the geometry of the roof box, the passage and the chamber. They measured the azimuth of the passage floor to fractions of a degree, and they compared that measured azimuth against the calculated position of the winter solstice sunrise as it would have appeared above the ridge of Red Mountain to the southeast of the tomb in the mid-4th millennium BCE. Precession matters here because over 5,000 years the tilt of the Earth's axis has itself changed by a small but measurable amount, and the sun's rising position at solstice has shifted correspondingly. When one accounts for that shift and for the slightly different horizon presented by the ridge in that era, before millennia of erosion and land use had reshaped its outline, the alignment tightens, it does not slacken. The passage of Newgrange, as originally cut, points to within about a degree of the ancient solstice sunrise, some measurements suggesting an accuracy of half that, well within the natural spread produced by the sun's finite disk and the multi-day window of near alignment either side of the solstice itself. The precision is not accidental. It is not a rough gesture in a plausible direction. It is a calibrated instrument, and what a calibrated instrument requires before it can be built is data. The builders of Newgrange could not have oriented their passage to within a degree of a horizon event without first knowing, from repeated observation, where on that horizon the event would occur. They could not have known that from a single observation, nor from 10, nor plausibly from the observations of a single lifetime. Solstice sunrise is a slippery target. The sun rises at nearly the same point on the horizon for several days on either side of the solstice itself. The very word solstice, in its Latin roots, means the standing still of the sun, so that determining the precise midpoint of that standing still requires the patient reduction of years, perhaps decades, of horizon markings, a stake driven into the ground each morning, a cairn built up over successive winters, a memory kept and passed on of the notch in the far ridge where the sun had first crested on some particular dawn a generation earlier. Whatever the specific technique, the result is the same. Before the first massive curbstone of Newgrange was laid, before the passage was aligned, before the roof box was framed, someone or some succession of someones had accumulated an observational record of the horizon that was thorough enough to fix the target within a degree. And that record of the quiet, unwritten, generation-spanning apprenticeship of eyes is the true foundation of the monument. The stones are only its expression. The implication propagates outward. If a community in the Boyne Valley in the mid-4th millennium BCE was capable of the sustained observational discipline required to build such an instrument, then the same is presumably true of the communities that built the Great Passage tombs of Orkney at roughly the same period, and of the communities that would raise, a few centuries later, the first phases of the monument that stands now on Salisbury Plain in southern England. And there, on the chalk downland of Wiltshire, on a low ridge overlooking a shallow valley where 2 rivers meet, one arrives at what is arguably the most examined, most contested, and most iconic astronomical instrument in the whole of the megalithic world. Stonehenge, unlike Newgrange, was not built in a single campaign. It was built in phases, over more than a millennium, and the monument one visits today is a palimpsest of interventions, some additive, some subtractive, some reorganizations of stones that had already been standing for centuries when they were moved. The earliest phase, dating to around 3000 BCE, consisted not of the great Sarsen trilithons that dominate the modern photographs, but of something considerably more modest, a roughly circular ditch and bank enclosing an interior nearly 100 metres across, and within that interior, spaced at regular intervals just inside the bank, a ring of 56 pits. The pits, named after the 17th century antiquary John Aubrey who first noticed them, the Aubrey holes, were dug into the chalk and appear to have contained at various points in the site's history upright wooden posts and in some cases cremated human remains. What they were originally for and why there were 56 of them are questions that have never received a satisfying answer. It was the number that caught Gerald Hawkins' attention when, in the early 1960s, he sat down with the plans of the monument and the punch cards of the IBM 1790 at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and asked whether the alignments of Stonehenge were, in any statistically meaningful sense, distinguishable from chance. His conclusions, published in Nature in 1963 and expanded into the book Stonehenge Decoded shortly afterward, were provocative in the extreme. The monument's principal axis, he confirmed, pointed to the midsummer sunrise on one side and to the midwinter sunset on the other, with the heel stone, a large unworked sarsen standing outside the ring, along the ceremonial avenue that leads toward the northeast, serving as a foresight for the solstitial dawn. The 4 station stones, set at the corners of a rectangle inscribed within the Aubrey circle, framed a set of alignments that pointed not to the sun but to the moon, and specifically to the extreme northerly and southerly rising and setting positions of the moon at the limits of what is known as the major lunar standstill, a cycle of 18 6/10 years, across which the moon's rising point on the horizon oscillates between 2 extreme envelopes considerably wider than the sun's annual range. That the corners of the station stone rectangle should align to the lunar extremes, Hawkins argued, was too specific to be coincidence. It required intent. But it was Fred Hoyle, the Cambridge astronomer whose name was by then already famous, or depending on one's view of the steady-state cosmology he championed, infamous, for his contributions to 20th century astrophysics, who in 1966 took Hawkins' proposal and pushed it into altogether stranger territory. Hoyle looked at the 56 Aubrey holes and asked what one might do with a ring of that particular number, and he noted that 56 is very nearly 3 times the length of the lunar nodal cycle expressed in whole years, the cycle across which the intersections of the moon's orbital plane with the plane of the ecliptic, the so-called lunar nodes, drift westward through the zodiac and return, over a period of just over 18.5 years, to their starting configuration. It is the lunar nodes that determine when eclipses can occur. Only when the sun and the moon happen to be near a node at the moment of new or full moon does the geometry line up for an eclipse to take place. Predict the position of the nodes, Hoyle observed, and you have, in principle, predicted the possibility of eclipses, and the Aubrey ring, with its 56 evenly spaced holes, provided, if one moved a set of markers around it at appropriate rates, a mechanical means of doing precisely that. Whether Hoyle was right, whether the Neolithic builders of Wiltshire actually used their ring of pits as an eclipse-predicting calculator, shuffling stones or wooden markers around the circle in a slow, ceremonial choreography that mirrored the drift of the invisible nodes, is a question that has never been decisively closed. Archaeologists on the whole have grown less rather than more sympathetic to the idea in the decades since. The evidence for markers being physically moved is absent. The alignments to lunar extremes, while real, might have been noticed and incorporated without any deeper cyclical understanding. And the number 56, one is reminded, is only very nearly 3 nodal cycles. Not exactly 3. The fit is suggestive, not clean. Yet the fact remains that a ring of 56 holes was dug into the chalk of southern England around 3000 BCE, that its geometry frames the extremes of a lunar cycle no single observer can complete in less than nearly 2 decades, and that the astronomer who first pointed this out was not a fringe theorist or an amateur enthusiast, but one of the most decorated cosmologists of his generation. What Hawkins and Hoyle between them did, whatever the ultimate verdict on their specific claims, was to shift the ground on which the argument was fought. Before them, the burden of proof lay on anyone who wished to claim that a prehistoric monument encoded astronomy. After them, however slowly and grudgingly, the burden began to shift the other way. Given the alignments demonstrably present at so many of these sites, what would it take to argue that they were not deliberate? The wooden posts have long since rotted from the Aubrey holes. The markers, if there ever were any, are gone. What remains is a ring of empty pits, patiently spaced around a chalk enclosure on a plain in southern England, still framing the two horizons, solar and lunar, that its makers appear to have watched for reasons we can only partly reconstruct. And so, the question the site poses is not, in the end, whether it worked as a computer. The question is why, 5 millennia ago, on a windswept downland at the western edge of Europe, human beings gathered the labour to arrange 56 holes in a circle at all. From the chalk of Wiltshire, our journey now leaves Europe altogether and crosses the Atlantic southward and westward, to a coastal desert so dry that in some valleys rain has not fallen within living memory. Here, on a high, wind-swept plateau between the Andean foothills and the Pacific, a gravel pampa stretching for hundreds of square kilometres across the southern coast of what is now Peru, the ground itself has been drawn upon. Not carved, not built up, drawn. The surface of the Pampa Colorada, the coloured plain, is a thin crust of dark stones, iron oxide blackened by tens of thousands of years of sun and desert varnish, resting on a paler, yellower soil beneath. To draw upon such a surface requires nothing more sophisticated than the removal of the darker pebbles from a chosen path, revealing the lighter ground below. The technique is almost embarrassingly simple. What it produced, over a period of perhaps 700 years spanning the Paracas and Nazca cultures, from roughly the closing centuries BCE through the middle of the first millennium CE, is one of the most disquieting monuments left by any ancient people anywhere on Earth. Straight lines that run for kilometres without deviation. Vast geometric trapezoids, their edges knife-sharp against the desert. Spirals, zigzags, rectangles nested inside rectangles. And scattered among the abstractions, figures, enormous, deliberate figures, of a spider with its legs splayed across 150 feet of pampa, of a hummingbird whose wingspan exceeds the length of a football pitch, of a monkey with a coiled tail, of a condor in flight, of a whale, of a strange humanoid on a hillside sometimes called the astronaut. There are more than 1,000 such geoglyphs, and for perhaps 1,500 years they lay all but unnoticed, blurred beneath a thin skin of dust, visible only to travellers who happened to cross them on foot, and who, at ground level, would have perceived nothing more than shallow paths through the stones. The lines came to modern attention only in the 20th century, when aircraft began to fly the coastal routes between Lima and the southern towns. From altitude, what had been invisible from the ground resolved into something extraordinary. Pilots reported strange markings, geometric and figurative both, stretching across the pampa as if the desert had been used as a page. Archaeologists arrived. Photographs were taken. And in 1940 a German-born mathematician named Maria Reich, then in her early 40s, made her way to the town of Nazca and began the work that would occupy the remaining 58 years of her life. She had trained in mathematics and astronomy in Dresden, worked as a governess and translator in Cusco, and by the time she reached the Pampa, she carried with her the tools of a discipline, trigonometry, spherical geometry, celestial mechanics, that few others in her adopted country then possessed. She began to measure. She swept the lines with brooms to reveal their edges. She recorded their bearings with a theodolite. She lived in a small hut on the edge of the desert, slept on a camp bed, drank little, ate less, and campaigned, ferociously, and against nearly every conceivable form of official indifference, for the protection of the site. Trucks and off-road drivers had begun to cross the pampa, cutting fresh scars through geoglyphs that had survived intact for 2 millennia. Reicher stood in their way. She lobbied ministries, she wrote letters, she used her own money to hire guards, and in the intervals between these battles she thought about what the lines might mean. Her conclusion, developed over decades of measurement and refined in a series of publications, was that the pampa was, in essence, a giant book of the sky. The lines, she argued, were oriented to significant astronomical events. The rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices, the risings of certain bright stars, the appearances and disappearances of prominent asterisms across the horizon at particular seasons of the year. In one of the phrases most often quoted from her, she described the desert as a huge blackboard on which giant hands had drawn clear and precise geometric designs. It was, in her reading, a calendar written on the ground rather than on parchment or in stone. A calendar whose function was to bind the movements of the heavens to the rhythms of an agricultural society living on the edge of one of the driest deserts in the world, where every drop of water that reached the coastal valleys had to be carefully husbanded and every season correctly anticipated. The astronomical hypothesis was compelling. It was also, from the moment it was proposed, contested. Critics pointed out that with so many lines running in so many directions, it was almost impossible to draw a line across the pampa that did not align, by chance, with some celestial event or other. The statistical argument was against her. The American astronomer Gerald Hawkins himself, the same Hawkins who had turned his computer on Stonehenge, visited the pampa in the late 1960s and tested Reicher's alignments with the same techniques he had used in Wiltshire. His conclusion, published in the following years, was cautious to the point of disappointment. The correlations with solar and stellar risings he found were no better than one would expect from random orientations. The pampa was not a calendar, or if it was not a calendar of the kind Reicher believed. Yet the story did not end there. In the decades that followed, other researchers took up the question with sharper instruments and narrower hypotheses. The American archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni, who has spent much of his career mapping the alignments of pre-Columbian sites across the Americas, examined the lines not as a single undifferentiated field, but as a network of features whose meanings varied by type. And the astronomer Phyllis Pitt-Luger, working with the great trapezoidal shapes that spread across the pampa like vast elongated arrowheads, argued that certain of these figures aligned with the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, the moment, once a year, when that little cluster of stars first reappears in the pre-dawn eastern sky after a period of invisibility behind the sun. In the Andean world, as in so much of the ancient world, the reappearance of the Pleiades was a matter of enormous consequence. It marked the beginning of the agricultural year, the moment when observations of the cluster's brightness were used to forecast the coming rains. Along the arid Peruvian coast, where every seasonal calculation was a matter of survival, such an alignment would not have been a decorative flourish. It would have been the calendar's most important entry. Mainstream Nazca scholarship in the meantime has moved in a different direction. Ethnographic and archaeological work by researchers such as Johann Reinhard has emphasized the role of the lines as ritual pathways, sacred routes walked in procession, leading toward water sources or toward mountains believed to be the abodes of the water-giving deities, in ceremonies whose function was to petition for rain in a landscape where rain was almost never given. On this reading, the lines are less a book of the sky than a choreography of the ground, paths to be traversed, not diagrams to be read, and yet, as so often in this story, the two readings are not truly opposed. The rains, in an Andean cosmology, come from the mountains. The mountains draw the rains from the sky is governed by the stars, and the star whose reappearance most reliably announces the season of rain is the same little cluster whose rising the trapezoids of Pitt-Luger's analysis appear to frame. To walk one of those enormous arrow-straight pathways at the right moment of the pre-dawn year would have been, simultaneously, to petition the mountain and to observe the sky and to know the season and to reaffirm the covenant between all three. What looks to us like separate categories, astronomy, ritual, agriculture, was, to the people who scored those figures into the desert, a single continuous act. The pampa, then, is not a blackboard covered in geometry, nor is it merely a ceremonial ground. It is something older and stranger than either, a field on which sky and land and human intention have been drawn together at scale into a single sustained argument about how the world holds together and how, by walking and watching and marking, one might keep it holding. Standing on one of the low hills that fringe the pampa, for the lines, contrary to a popular misconception, are not visible only from the air. They can be seen too from the natural vantage points that overlook the plain. One begins to sense the outline of that argument. The desert stretches away into a shimmering distance. The dark ground has been peeled back in lines so straight they resemble the ruled edges of a page. Somewhere below the eastern horizon, at a particular time of year, a cluster of 6 or 7 faint stars is preparing to rise, and the ground has been drawn to greet it. What did they know, one is bound to ask, and how did they come to know it, and why did they choose to inscribe their knowledge upon the earth on such an implausible scale? The lines are silent. Eicher's 40 years of measurement, her theodolite and her broom, produced hypotheses rather than answers. The controversy she began has not been resolved, but whichever reading one prefers, calendar, prayer path, cosmogram, or all three at once, the Pampa poses the same question that Stonehenge and Nabta and Göbekli Tepe pose. Why does the sky matter to these people so much that they will move mountains of stone or pull 1,000 kilometers of pebbles from the desert in order to inscribe its rhythms on the ground? From the coastal deserts of Peru, our journey shifts across the Pacific to the sweltering forests of mainland Southeast Asia, where the same question is asked in an entirely different key. Here, in the alluvial plain north of the great Tonle Sap Lake in what is now Cambodia, the Khmer king Suryavarman I, a ruler of an empire that at its height administered a population perhaps larger than that of contemporary Paris and London combined, commissioned during the first half of the 12th century a temple whose scale is difficult to convey without recourse to the comparisons that have become clichés. Angkor Wat, dedicated originally to Vishnu and reoriented over centuries into a Buddhist sanctuary, is the largest single religious monument on the surface of the earth. Its outer moat encloses an area of roughly 200 hectares. Its central quincunx of towers, one at each corner of a raised platform, the tallest at the centre, rises above concentric galleries whose walls are carved with more than 1,000 metres of continuous bas-relief. Its construction is estimated to have absorbed the labour of tens of thousands of workers over some 3 or 4 decades, and its design, on any conventional reading, is a monumental essay in Hindu cosmology. The central tower is Mount Meru, the axis of the universe. The surrounding towers are its subsidiary peaks. The enclosing moat is the cosmic ocean. The galleries with their reliefs are the successive continents and ages of the world. What the American architectural scholar Eleanor Maneker argued in her carefully argued 1996 study Angkor Wat, Time, Space and Kingship was that this cosmological program is not merely thematic but numerical. Working painstakingly through the dimensions of the temple as recorded in the Khmer unit of the hat, a cubit of roughly half a metre, Maneker identified a series of measurements that appear to correspond to key astronomical and calendrical cycles. Certain lengths, she showed, correspond to the number of days in the solar year, others to the days in the lunar year of 12 synodic months, others still to intervals connected to the precession of the equinoxes and to the vast time cycles, the yugas, of Hindu cosmology, in which the universe is understood to age through 4 successive epochs before dissolving and being renewed. The tower count and the gallery dimensions on her reading are not decorative choices. They are inscriptions in stone of the same kind of astronomical knowledge that at Newgrange is inscribed in a passage of shadow, and at Stonehenge in the geometry of a ring. Maneker's proposal has been contested in its details, but it rests on the sober foundation of measurement, and it treats the temple as what it plainly is, a colossal, deliberate monument built by a literate court that maintained astronomers, mathematicians and calendrical specialists whose work is attested in contemporary inscriptions and in the practices of the modern Khmer year. In her reading, Angkor is a working observatory of a highly specific kind, a place where measurement connects the temple to the stars and the cosmos, where the numbers bridge the gap between the human and the divine, where the king and his god are quite literally made one by geometry. There is, however, a further and altogether more contentious claim about the site, one that pushes the astronomy of Angkor into territory as strange, in its way, as any we have visited. In the late 1990s, the researcher John Grigsby, working alongside the writer Graham Hancock, proposed that the ground plan of the wider Angkor complex, not the single temple of Angkor Wat alone, but the larger network of temples that surrounds it, mirrors the constellation Draco, the celestial dragon that coils around the northern pole of the sky. Sky charts prepared with modern planetarium software show, they argued, a striking correspondence between the positions of the major temples and the pattern of the dragon's stars. But, and this is the point on which the whole claim turns, the mirroring does not match the sky, as it appeared in Suryavarman's time. It matches, according to Grigsby and Hancock, the sky as it appeared around 10,500 years earlier, in the 11th millennium BCE, a date accessible only through the calculation of precession run backward across more than 12,000 years. The claim is that Angkor is not merely a temple encoding the current sky, but a monument to an ancestral sky, a diagram of the heavens as they stood at a moment so remote from the 12th century of our era that it precedes the invention of agriculture, the domestication of animals, and the founding of the earliest cities. Mainstream Khmer scholarship has treated the proposal with pronounced skepticism. The selection of temples used to trace the constellation is inconsistent, critics have pointed out. Some are included and others of comparable prominence excluded. The correspondences, when tested more strictly, blur. There is no contemporary Khmer text that speaks of such a project. There is no reason, in the known religious cosmology of 12th century Cambodia, to seek an alignment to a lost prehistoric epoch. And yet the mere fact that the claim can be made at all, that when one sits down with the plan of a medieval temple complex and the sky of 11,000 years ago and asks whether the two can be brought into correspondence, one gets an answer that is at least suggestive, poses a question the discipline has scarcely begun to reckon with. What would it mean for a monument to encode not the current sky, but an ancestral sky? What would it require in the way of astronomical knowledge to reach backward across a precessional cycle and reconstruct where the pole once stood? Could it be that certain traditions preserved, in ritual or in oral memory, or in the guarded arithmetic of temple priests, a picture of the heavens as they had appeared to some remoter ancestor, and that this ancestral picture was, in some cases, given form on the ground? The mainstream reading of Angkor does not require any such speculation. Manika's numbers stand on their own. The temple's cosmology, its calendar, its solstitial and equinoctial orientations are the work of the 12th century and speak to the sky of the 12th century. But the shadow of the Draco proposal, unproven and probably unprovable, hangs over the site like a mist rising from the moat at dawn. Standing on the western causeway at first light, looking eastward through the concentric gates toward the central tower, one cannot help but wonder how far back the calculation runs. Our journey now shifts westward again, across the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic and the length of South America, into the high Andes of Peru, to the valley that the Inca called, in their own language, the navel of the world. Cusco lies at an altitude of over 3,000 meters, cradled by mountains, at the meeting point of two rivers, whose confluence was regarded as sacred long before the Inca themselves arrived to make the site their imperial capital. What the Inca did with the valley, in the 2 centuries or so during which they ruled it before the Spanish conquest of the 1530s, was to convert its landscape into a working astronomical instrument on a scale that Europe would not attempt until the great observatories of the 17th century. The centre of the instrument was the Coricanchi, the Temple of the Sun, a walled compound at the heart of the city whose stone masonry, those famously precise polygonal joints, so tight that no blade could be inserted between them, has survived beneath the colonial church that was built upon its foundations. From the Coricancha, radiating outward across the surrounding landscape like the spokes of a wheel, ran 41 sacred pathways, the seques. Along the seke, at intervals determined by ritual and by topography, were arranged shrines called huacas, whose number, according to the 17th century Spanish chronicler Bernabé Cobo, whose account remains the principal source for the system, totaled 328. Some of the huasas were springs, some were stones, some were battlefields, tombs, caves, or particular bends in a river. Together, they constituted a landscape densely mapped by ritual, and the seques that linked them were maintained by particular kinship groups within Cusco's aristocracy, each responsible for the observances associated with a specific pathway. The interpretation of this extraordinary system has been the work of a generation of scholars. The anthropologist Brian Bauer and the astronomer David Dearborn, working together in the late 20th century, undertook the sustained fieldwork required to test what the Sikh system actually was. Their findings, published in the 1990s and elaborated in subsequent studies, established that the system was, among other things, a working solar and lunar calendar. The number of huacas, 328, corresponds strikingly to 12 sidereal lunar months, and Bauer and Dearborn were able to show that certain seques did indeed align to the horizon positions of the rising and setting sun at the solstices, and that the pattern of the huacas encoded a system by which the tropical year and the lunar month could be brought into synchronization. The Coricancha, they argued, functioned as the observational center of the system. From within its walls, priests could sight along particular directions toward horizon markers that framed the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and of all the celestial bodies whose risings and settings were watched from Cusco, none was watched more attentively than the little cluster of 6 or 7 faint stars that the Quechua called Colca, the storehouse or granary. The Pleiades, in the Inca cosmology, were the master calibration star of the empire. Their heliacal rising in June, in the days around the southern winter solstice, marked the beginning of the agricultural year, and the observations were not merely ceremonial. According to accounts recorded by early Spanish chroniclers and elaborated by modern researchers, the priests observed the appearance of the cluster on its first pre-dawn rising, how bright it was, how sharply its component stars stood out from the background sky, and drew from this observation a forecast of the coming season's rains. A bright, clear rising promised good rains and an ordinary planting date. A dim or blurred rising warned of drought and prompted the state to advise a delay in planting to protect the crop. In a world whose harvest failure could not be softened by imported grain, this forecast was not a superstition. It was the Empire's most valuable single piece of meteorological intelligence. And then, occasionally, the Pleiades did not rise at all. When a distant volcanic eruption injected sulfate aerosols high into the stratosphere, the thin veil of dust could, for a season or two, dim the faintest stars beyond visibility to the unaided eye. To the observers at Cusco, this appeared as an omen of the direst possible kind. The granary of the sky, on which the year was hinged, had been withdrawn from view. Modern climatology has now identified several such aerosol events in the historical record, and their coincidence with recorded periods of unrest, famine, and political crisis in the Andean world is difficult to dismiss as accident. Astronomy in Cusco was not an ornament of statecraft. It was the operating system of the state, the mechanism by which planting and harvest, taxation and tribute, ritual and sacrifice, coronation and succession were all timed against a shared cosmological clock. The 41 sects radiating from the Coricancha were the wires of that clock. The 328 huacas along them were its numerals, and the Pleiades, appearing each June above the eastern peaks, were the second hand whose reliability the whole empire required. To walk one of those seeks today, many of the pathways can still be traced, and Bauer and Dearborn's fieldwork mapped a great number of them across the modern landscape, is to sense, faintly, the density of the system that once ordered these hillsides. A spring here, a boulder there, a bend in an ancient wall. Each was once a station in a calendar so intricate that its full reconstruction has occupied scholars for decades and remains incomplete. And above all of it, unchanged in its slow procession across the winter dawn, the little cluster of 6 or 7 faint stars still rises each June above the same eastern horizon, brighter in some years and dimmer in others, indifferent to whether anyone is now watching for it or not. Yet somewhere, in the villages of the highlands, the observation is still made. The old almanac has not entirely faded, and what the Inca knew, that the year begins with the Pleiades, that the cluster's brightness foretells the rain, that the agricultural calendar of an entire civilization may hinge on the appearance of a knot of stars a few hundred light years away, is a piece of knowledge that runs, one begins to suspect, far deeper into the human past than any single empire. For the Pleiades, one now begins to notice, keep appearing in this story. They rose above the trapezoids of the Nazca Pampa, they calibrated the year of the Inca, and they will rise again and again as our journey continues. For wherever human beings have watched the sky and set their calendars by it, that small, dim, easily missed cluster seems to have been given a weight out of all proportion to its apparent brightness. The question of why is one that we are not yet ready to answer. Consider for a moment the strangeness of what is being described. The Pleiades are not a bright constellation. They are not one of the great blazing beacons of the winter sky, not Sirius, not Canopus, not Vega, not Arcturus. They are a small, faint, huddled smudge of light in the shoulder of Taurus, easy to overlook, easier still to lose in the glow of a rising moon or the haze of a humid horizon. A city dweller today, standing beneath the sodium wash of streetlights, may go an entire lifetime without ever consciously registering their presence. And yet, in the sacred literature of nearly every ancient culture on the inhabited surface of this planet, this dim little knot of stars occupies a place of extraordinary honour. It is not merely present in the world's cosmologies, it is central to them. It is, in a strange and unsettling way, universal. Begin with the Greeks, whose account is the most familiar in the Western tradition. In the mythology recorded by Hesiod and elaborated by later poets, the Pleiades are the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas and the ocean nymph Pleione, Maia, Electra, Taygete, Alcyone, Seleno, Sterope, and Merope. They are pursued through the wilderness by the giant hunter Orion, whose lust for them is relentless, and Zeus, moved to pity, transforms the sisters first into doves and then into stars, setting them into the sky where the hunter can chase but never catch them. Orion is placed in the sky as well, forever rising in pursuit at their heels, forever failing to close the distance. 6 of the sisters shine clearly. The 7th, according to the ancient tellings, hides herself out of shame, either because she loved a mortal, or because she alone of her sisters was seduced, or simply because she grieves. The lost Pleiad is a fixed feature of the Greek account, and it is with this detail that the story begins, quietly, to become very strange indeed. Travel to the other side of the world, to the deserts and coastlines and rainforests of Aboriginal Australia, and one encounters a body of tradition that could not, on any reasonable historical model, have been in contact with the Aegean. And yet the story, in its essential elements, is the same, across dozens of language groups, from the Adnyamathanha of the Flinders Ranges to the Kokatha of the Great Victoria Desert, from the Wiradjuri of the inland to the peoples of the Kimberley. The Pleiades are recognised as a group of young women, and they are being pursued. In many versions, they are the 7 sisters, fleeing across the landscape from an unwanted suitor, a lecherous elder figure often identified with the stars of Orion. He follows them from waterhole to waterhole, from ridge to ridge. They hide, they flee, they are almost caught. The pursuit ends only when they are lifted into the sky, where the same chase continues, unresolved, above the heads of the storytellers. And in these Australian traditions too, the 7th sister is sometimes said to be lost, hidden, or dimmer than her siblings. This is not a case of a single motif appearing in 2 adjacent traditions. This is the same story, a small cluster of young women, pursued by a violent male hunter figure, one of them missing or hidden, appearing in oral literatures separated by tens of thousands of kilometres of ocean, and by a common ancestry that, if it exists at all, must reach back into the deep prehistoric past. The scholarly work of Ray Norris and Dwayne Hamacher, whose collaborations with Aboriginal elders across many communities have been among the most careful attempts to document Indigenous astronomical knowledge on the continent, has drawn attention to precisely this puzzle. Norris in particular has argued that the persistence of the 7 Sisters narrative across such a wide range of Australian language groups in a form so structurally close to the Greek myth may point to a common origin far earlier than the divergence of these peoples, perhaps in the astronomical lore that human beings carried with them out of Africa. Could it be that the story is genuinely that old? Could a myth have travelled with its tellers across ice ages and land bridges and 40,000 years of separation and still be recognisable at the far ends of the world? The suggestion is astonishing. And yet what is the alternative? Independent invention, twice, of the same specific narrative concerning the same specific stars? Nor does the pattern stop there. Across the Pacific, the Maori of Aotearoa know the cluster as Matariki, whose heliacal rising in the pre-dawn sky of late June or early July marks the beginning of the new year, a time for the remembrance of the dead, the release of their spirits, the reckoning of the season past, and the planning of the season to come. In recent years, the observance of Matariki has been restored as a national holiday in New Zealand, and the ceremonies now performed at dawn on hillsides above the coast are continuations of a practice whose deep antiquity is undoubted. In Hawaiian tradition, the cluster is Makali'i, and its rising likewise anchors the ceremonial calendar. In Japan, the same knot of stars is called Subaru. The word means gathered together, or united, and the automotive company of that name reproduces the cluster in its corporate logo, 6 blue stars against a field, a modern glyph whose iconography reaches back through centuries of Japanese sky lore to something far older than any car. In the Norse world, the cluster was Freya's hens. In early Christian Europe, it was sometimes called the hen and chicks. Among the Blackfoot of the North American plains, it was 6 brothers rescued into the sky. Among the Cherokee and the Onondaga, variations on the theme of children lost or transformed appear. In the Book of Job, in one of the oldest strata of the Hebrew Bible, the poet places into the mouth of God a challenge. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? The pairing of the 2 constellations, the cluster and the hunter, is already ancient by the time the passage is written down. And in all of this, across cultures that could not possibly have coordinated their vocabularies, three specific features keep recurring. The Pleiades are almost always identified as a group, most often a group of women or children or siblings. They're almost always associated in some way with Orion, whether as pursued to his pursuer or as celestial neighbours whose motions are read together. And most curiously of all, the lost Pleiad, the missing seventh, appears again and again in traditions that had no way of comparing notes. The Greeks knew her, the Aboriginal Australians know her, some Native American traditions know her. Even in modern star counts, observers with sharp eyes and dark skies sometimes report seeing 7 stars where most people see 6, and this ambiguity may itself have fed the tradition. But there is also a stranger possibility. Some of the stars in the Pleiades cluster are variable, and it is astronomically plausible, though it cannot be demonstrated with certainty, that one of the brighter members has dimmed measurably over the last several thousand years. If that dimming is real, and if it happened within the span of human observation, then the lost sister story may not be a metaphor at all. It may be a memory of an actual astronomical change, preserved in the amber of narrative, passed down across dozens of generations by peoples whose only means of storage was the human voice. That is a claim that must be handled carefully. The evidence for a historically visible dimming of a Pleiades member is contested, and the correlation with the myths may be coincidence. And yet the question itself, is it possible that a story could preserve, for 10,000 years or more, the memory of a specific event in the sky, is one that opens onto a set of ideas that the 20th century found deeply uncomfortable, and that the 21st is only now beginning to reconsider. For the question of how long an oral tradition can remain faithful to an observation is not merely a question about the Pleiades, it is a question about everything we think we know concerning the depth of human cultural memory. And it brings us, at last, to the master cycle behind so much of what we have been describing, the wobble in the axis, the slow drift of the heavens, the phenomenon that makes it possible even to ask whether Nabta Playa's builders were tracking Orion across 16,000 years, or whether Ankor's plan mirrors the coils of Draco as it circled a pole star long since displaced. Imagine a spinning top on a table. It spins swiftly on its own axis, but as its momentum bleeds slowly away, the axis itself begins to trace a lazy circle, the top nodding as it spins. The Earth does something very similar. It rotates once a day about its own axis, that familiar spin whose surface we all live upon, but that axis is itself slowly wheeling in a great circle against the fixed background of the distant stars, tugged by the gravity of the sun and the moon upon the equatorial bulge of a planet that is not quite a perfect sphere. The full circuit of this wheeling, one complete tracing of the Great Cone, takes, according to modern measurement, approximately 25,772 years. That is precession, and its consequences for anyone who watches the sky patiently across generations are profound. Because the axis is drifting, the point of sky to which it points, the celestial pole, is also drifting. Today, the northern axis points very close to the star Polaris in Ursa Minor, and Polaris is therefore what we call the pole star. 5,000 years ago, when the passage of Newgrange was aligned and the earliest phases of Stonehenge were being laid out, the pole star was not Polaris at all. It was Thuban, a modest star in the constellation Draco, the very constellation whose form some researchers claim is mirrored in the ground plan of Angkor Wat. 13,000 years from now, the pole will have drifted to Vega, one of the brightest stars in the summer sky. The entire relationship of the northern sky to the ground will have inverted, and the constellations that now rise in the east will rise in different places, at different seasons, at different hours of the night. The zodiac itself, that band of constellations through which the sun appears to travel across the year, shifts westward against the seasons by roughly 1 degree every 71.5 years, which means that the constellation in which the sun rises on the vernal equinox drifts by one whole zodiacal sign every 2,150 years or so. This is the origin of the ages, the age of Taurus, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius, that appear so often in esoteric literature. They are not mystical fictions. They are the crude astronomical measure of a real physical wobble in the axis of the world. In the standard Western history of science, the discovery of this cycle is attributed to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century before the Common Era. around 127 BCE, comparing his own precise measurements of the positions of certain fixed stars against the older records of Babylonian and earlier Greek astronomers, Hipparchus noticed that the coordinates had shifted, not randomly as errors would have, but systematically in one direction, by an amount consistent across the sky. He drew the correct conclusion. The frame of reference itself was moving. The equinoxes were drifting westward against the stars. He estimated the rate. His figure was a little slow but astonishingly close to the modern value, and in doing so he inaugurated the historical science of precession. It is one of the greatest single feats of observational reasoning in the ancient world, and it was made possible, crucially, by the existence of written records. Hipparchus could compare his own measurements to Babylonian tablets and earlier Greek catalogues, because such catalogues existed. Without writing, without preserved numerical data spanning centuries, the wobble is invisible within a single human lifetime. It amounts to a shift so slight, 1 degree in 71 years, an angle 2/3 the width of the full moon, over the course of a long human life, that no unaided observer could detect it directly. Only cumulative records reveal it. That, at any rate, is the mainstream account, and it is a strong account. It is grounded in surviving texts, in a documented sequence of observations, in a discoverer whose name and dates we know. It requires no extraordinary claims. It gives to Hipparchus what appears rightly to be his, the first explicit scientific recognition of a cycle that had, until then, been operating in the sky unremarked. And then, in 1969, 2 scholars published a book that proposed something else entirely. Their names were Giorgio de Santillana, a professor of the history of science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Hertha von Dechend, a historian of science at the University of Frankfurt. Their book was called Hamlet's Mill, an essay investigating the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through myth. It is a difficult book, dense, elusive, sometimes maddeningly opaque, ranging across the mythologies of the Norse and the Egyptians, the Finns and the Iranians, the Polynesians and the Maya. But its central claim can be stated simply. De Santillana and von der Schend argued that precession of the equinoxes was known, was watched, was measured, was worried over, long before Hipparchus put a name to it, and they argued that the way this knowledge was preserved, across the millennia before writing existed to hold it, was through myth. The great cosmological narratives of the ancient world, they contended, are not primitive attempts to explain thunder or sunrise. They are a technical language. Their gods and heroes, their mills and trees and floods and dismemberments are code. Beneath the surface of the stories, Norse Yggdrasil, whose branches hold up the sky and whose falling is the end of the world. The Egyptian Osiris, dismembered and reassembled and set into the constellations. The mill that grinds out ages and salt and gold and finally sinks into the sea. Beneath these narratives, they argued, was an astronomical language, a way of encoding the slow drift of the heavens across ages so long that no single teller ever saw more than a fragment of the pattern. Hamlet's Mill was, and remains, deeply controversial. Mainstream historians of science have often dismissed it as speculative overreach, a reading in which almost any myth can be made to encode almost any astronomical cycle, if the interpreter is inventive enough. The book has been criticised for cherry-picked evidence, for loose etymologies, for a willingness to see pattern where none may exist, and these criticisms are not without force. Yet the book has never quite gone away. It continues to be cited, contested, admired, denounced. Because what it points to is a possibility that the standard chronology of astronomical discovery cannot easily contain. The possibility that precession, or something like it, was noticed long before the 2nd century BCE. That the drift of the pole star from Thuban toward Polaris, visible across only a few dozen generations, was a phenomenon that mattered to peoples who had no written catalogues, but who did have something else, a cultural apparatus for preserving observation across many lifetimes. And once that possibility is entertained, a great many of the sites we have been visiting begin to look different. If Nabta Playa's alignments really do encode positions of Orion's belt, as they stood 8,000 years earlier than the calendar circle itself, then either the correlation is coincidence, the stones are pointing where any random stones might point, and the astronomers have projected meaning onto noise, or the builders knew something about the sky that they should not have known. If Angkor Wat's plan really does mirror the coils of Draco as they were positioned in the 4th millennium BCE, long before the temple was built, Then again, either the parallel is illusion, or the builders had access to a body of astronomical tradition far deeper than their own century. If the sarsens of Stonehenge were arranged to mark lunar standstills, whose full cycle takes almost 19 years to complete, then someone at Stonehenge was watching the sky across the span of a human generation, and remembering what had been seen. And if the Pleiades traditions of Aboriginal Australia really do preserve in their structure an observation of the cluster's behaviour that dates back to the deep prehistoric past, then the storage medium of pre-literate humanity was not as fragile as we have been taught to believe. Which brings us to the question of the medium itself. If knowledge of the sky, of alignments, of cycles, of the peculiar shifting of Sirius against the dawn, of the brightness of the Pleiades in a good year and a bad, really did need to survive across the span of centuries or millennia before writing existed to catch it, then by what physical means was it held? And here, the work of a scholar in Australia, the cognitive archaeologist Lynn Kelly, becomes indispensable. Kelly's central insight, developed across a series of books and papers, is that oral cultures do not simply remember. They construct elaborate architectures for remembering, techniques, some of them still practiced today by champion memorizers under the borrowed classical name of the method of Lotze, which anchor abstract information to specific physical locations. A song, a story, a genealogy, a body of medical or navigational or astronomical knowledge is not held in the head as an undifferentiated stream. It is held as a walk. Each stanza, each fact, each observation is attached to a place, a tree, a rock, a bend in a river, a carved stone in a ring. When the initiate walks the sequence, or dances it, or chants it while pointing to each landmark in turn, the information is retrieved not by unaided memory, but by the interaction of memory with the landscape itself. The landscape is a mnemonic device. The stones are pages. Kelly's argument, developed in dialogue with the ethnographic literature on indigenous knowledge systems around the world, is that many of the megalithic monuments whose function we have puzzled over for so long were precisely such memory spaces. The great stone circles, the alignments, the mounds and the seeks and the standing pillars were not only or primarily astronomical instruments, they were physical libraries. The alignments were real. The sight lines to solstice, to standstill, to heliacal rising were built in and used. But around and through these functional geometries ran a second, denser layer of information, the mnemonic layer, in which each stone was a heading in a vast oral encyclopedia of lore, genealogy, seasonal ecology, medicine, ritual, and sky knowledge. To visit the site was to open the book. To walk it was to read. This model, if it is correct, dissolves at a stroke one of the most persistent difficulties in imagining how pre-literate societies could have preserved astronomy across the millennia. It has often been assumed that oral transmission is inherently unreliable, that a story told and retold across many generations must eventually corrupt, drift, decay into fantasy. And in the absence of any external anchor, this is largely true. But when the story is anchored to a stone, and the stone is anchored to the ground, and the ground is anchored to the horizon along which the sun rises on a specific day of the year, then the mnemonic architecture becomes something quite different. The stone does not forget. It sits in the same place, at the same angle, aligned to the same distant point on the horizon, from the moment it is set until the moment the Earth reclaims it. As long as initiates continue to walk the site, and to chant the knowledge attached to each of its landmarks, the information can be checked, generation after generation, against the physical fact of the alignment. If the tradition drifts, the sun does not. It rises where it rises, and the stones show it, and any competent successor is in a position to notice a discrepancy and to correct the transmission. Dwayne Hamaker, whose fieldwork with Aboriginal Australian elders has already been touched upon, has documented specific cases in which sky knowledge encoded in landscape and song appears to have survived, essentially uncorrupted, across intervals so long that they strain conventional models of oral fidelity. Descriptions of coastal features that were dry land during the last glacial maximum, encoded in stories that place the shoreline where it stood not a few centuries ago but many thousands of years ago. Descriptions of specific stellar events, of variable stars, of meteor showers, of the seasonal behaviour of the sky, that align with reconstructions from modern astronomy of what would have been visible from those specific latitudes in specific deep past epochs. The evidence is fragmentary, and Hamaker himself is scrupulous about the limits of what can be inferred. but the accumulation is suggestive. Something in the cultural machinery of these societies, something in the marriage of story to place, of chant to landscape, of ceremony to horizon, has been holding information intact across intervals for which the conventional shelf life of oral tradition would predict complete decay. If Kelly is right, and if Hammaker is right, then the megalithic monuments of the ancient world may deserve a new description. They are not only instruments, they are not only calendars, they are not only temples, they are memory devices. They are what a pre-literate civilization builds when it has knowledge too important to lose, and no other medium in which to hold it. The Nazca line pointing to the Pleiades, the Nabta stone aligned to Sirius, the T-pillar at Göbekli Tepe with its carved constellation of animals, the roof box of Newgrange catching the solstice sun, each of them, on this reading, is not merely an object that does something. It's an object that says something, and keeps on saying it, generation after generation, into a future that the builders had no way of knowing would ever come. The stone is patient. The stone can wait. The stone does not need to eat or sleep or remember. It only needs to sit where it was put, and to catch the sun where it was told to catch it, and let the humans who come after do the rest. And the question that has been forming quietly through everything we have so far seen, the question of how these dispersed peoples, separated by continents and by millennia, came to know so much of the same sky, begins to admit of at least the shape of an answer. Not that they were in contact, not necessarily that any single ancient civilization seeded them all, but that the sky itself is a shared inheritance, that human cognition, in its behavioural modernity, has been essentially the same for far longer than the received chronologies have allowed, and that the techniques for encoding and transmitting what the sky teaches, through story, through song, through ceremony, and above all through the placement of stones, were within reach of any sufficiently patient community, anywhere on Earth, for as long as human beings have gathered around fires at night and looked up. Whether that inheritance is really as deep as its most ambitious readers suggest, or whether the resemblances across cultures are more fragile than they appear, is a matter that no single site can settle. What can be said is this: the stone is a slower medium than the voice, and a slower medium than the page, and it forgets less than either. It is not perhaps an accident that when human beings first began to write down what they knew about the heavens, they were writing down, in many cases, what stone had already been saying silently for a very long time. And here we arrive at the hardest ground in the whole of this inquiry, the place where the story becomes not a march of confirmations but a contested field, where honest scholars and eloquent popularizers have been shouting past each other for the better part of half a century, and where the listener has a right to know how much of what has been said so far is bedrock, how much is well-supported inference, and how much is a beautiful shape drawn faintly across the dark. The discipline of archaeoastronomy, as it exists inside the modern academy, is a narrow, cautious, statistical thing. It insists on material context. It insists on the surveyed pillar, the dated potsherd, the measured horizon, the calculated declination, the probability distribution. Its practitioners, Clive Ruggles in Britain, Edwin Krupp at the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, Juan Antonio Belmonte in the Canary Islands, Giulio Magli in Milan, and a small international community of others, spend their careers arguing that the field's legitimacy depends on refusing exactly the leaps that make the subject exciting to the public. An alignment for them is not a story. It is a claim about an angle in the ground, a horizon feature and a celestial body, and the claim has to be tested against the null hypothesis that anyone drawing enough lines through enough stones will eventually hit something in the sky. They demand what they call site-based, culturally contextualized evidence. They demand statistical significance. They demand replicability. They demand, above all, that the researcher explain not only why an alignment is present, but why its presence should be read as intentional, rather than as one of the many accidents that a rich sky and a rich landscape will inevitably produce. On the other side, outside the seminar rooms and the peer-reviewed journals, there has grown up over roughly the same interval a parallel literature of enormous popularity and equally enormous ambition. Its central figures are known even to people who have never read a page of academic archaeology. Robert Bauval, a Belgian-born engineer, proposed in the early 1990s that the three Great Pyramids of Giza were not laid out as three isolated tombs, but as a ground plan of the three stars of Orion's belt, and that the whole plateau, with the Nile playing the role of the Milky Way, was a map of the heavens as they stood in a specific deep epoch. His book with Adrian Gilbert, published in 1994, became an international bestseller, and the Orion correlation theory entered the public imagination as if it had been proved. Graham Hancock, a former journalist, took the argument further in a sequence of books beginning with Fingerprints of the Gods, proposing that the astronomical sophistication visible at Giza, at Angkor, at Tiwanaku, at Göbekli Tepe was not the invention of the cultures to which archaeology conventionally assigns it, but the surviving trace of an older, lost civilization, destroyed by cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, and remembered only in the myths of flood and fire that appear, tellingly, on every inhabited continent. The academic response was immediate and for the most part unanimous. Edwin Krupp, writing in the pages of Sky and Telescope, examined Bauval's claim with the care of a man who has spent his working life measuring exactly the kind of alignments Bauval was invoking, and he pointed out that in order to make the three pyramids match Orion's belt in orientation, one had to flip the sky. The map that Bauval was drawing on the ground did not correspond to the sky as it appeared overhead from Giza. It corresponded to the sky's mirror image. Bauval countered that this was a misreading of his method, that the observer was looking south along the Nile and interpreting the arrangement accordingly, and that the correspondence stood. The exchange, which continues in one form or another to this day, is not really about geometry. It is about what counts as evidence for intention. A resemblance of three bright points to three large objects in a universe crowded with bright points and large objects is not, by itself, a demonstration that the objects were built to mirror the points. It is only a demonstration that the resemblance exists. To take the further step, to claim that the mirroring was intended and that it encoded a specific epoch and that the epoch pointed to a lost civilization, requires evidence of a different order altogether, evidence that mainstream Egyptology, working from tomb inscriptions, from the pyramid texts, from the recovered organizational records of the workmen's villages, has consistently declined to find. Hancock's thesis is broader still and correspondingly harder to test. The claim that a technologically sophisticated culture existed before the Younger Dryas, that its remnants seeded the astronomical and architectural traditions of every subsequent civilization, and that it left no direct material trace because the cataclysm was thorough enough to erase it, has the peculiar structure of a hypothesis that is designed to be unfalsifiable. If no artifacts are found, that is because they were destroyed. If some correspondence is found across widely separated cultures, that is evidence of the common seed. If no correspondence is found, that is evidence only of how deeply the memory has been buried. The Society for American Archaeology and other professional bodies have been unusually direct in their criticism, arguing that the method cherry-picks convergences, dismisses inconvenient chronologies, and, in its more polemical moments, disparages the practicing archaeologists whose site reports and radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic sections constitute the actual evidence base for the human past. The archaeologist Flint Dibble, in a widely watched public debate, put the position with a bluntness that captures the mood of the profession. It is not, he said, that Hancock is proposing something they have not considered. It is simply that they strongly believe he is wrong, and yet the honest observer, listening to both sides, is compelled to notice something uncomfortable. The academic critique is correct in its specifics. The Orion correlation does require the flipping, the lost civilization does lack direct evidence, the popular literature does cherry-pick, and the academic critique is also, at the same time, curiously bad at accounting for the emotional pull of the popular claim. Millions of readers did not turn to Hancock and Bauval because they had been misled about the details of pyramid orientation. They turned because the received chronology of human accomplishment, in which everything interesting begins with Sumerian city-states and everything before is prehistory, felt too small to accommodate what they had seen with their own eyes at Giza, at Angkor, at Machu Picchu, at Newgrange. The popular literature filled a vacuum that the professional literature, in its proper caution, had left unfilled. Some of what filled it was speculation dressed as revelation. Some of it was, and remains, worth the argument. Distinguishing the two, sentence by sentence and claim by claim, is not a task the documentary can complete on the listener's behalf. It is a task the listener has to undertake for themselves, and the first step is knowing that the task exists. What can be said with confidence, and what the more responsible archaeoastronomers have been saying for a generation, is that the sky-related achievements of the ancient world are real enough to warrant patient study without needing a lost civilization to explain them. The behavioural modernity of the human mind is old enough. The transmission mechanisms of oral tradition and monumental architecture are powerful enough. The observational patience of small societies embedded in a single landscape across many generations is deep enough. One does not need Atlantis to explain Nabta Playa. One needs only cattle herders, a horizon, and time. Whether that is the whole of the answer, or whether some other and stranger story is also true beneath it, is precisely the question that the sky itself is not going to answer. What the sky will do and what the stones will do, and what the newer instruments now trained on both are beginning to do, is give us a great deal more material with which to argue. Because if the war over the sky is one axis of the present moment in this field, the other axis, running at right angles to it, is a revolution in what can be seen. The stones have been sitting in the ground for as long as the stones have been in the ground. What has changed, and changed very recently, is the eye we bring to them. Consider Angkor. For centuries, the great temples of the Khmer Empire, Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, the Bayon, Ta Prohm strangled in the roots of the strangler fig, stood in the Cambodian jungle as isolated marvels, their scale astonishing but their setting apparently wilderness. Then, in 2012 and again in 2015, an international consortium known as the Cambodian Archaeological LIDAR Initiative flew aircraft mounted with laser scanning equipment over roughly 1,000 square kilometers of forest surrounding the temple complex. The lasers pulsed downward through the canopy, through the tangle of leaves and vines and branches, and struck the ground beneath, and returned to the aircraft a measurement of the elevation of the forest floor, accurate to within a few centimeters. The scans were then processed to strip away the trees, leaving only the shape of the earth. What appeared on the resulting maps was not wilderness at all. It was a city, a vast, formally planned, gridded urban settlement, streets and reservoirs and house mounds and hydraulic works and neighbourhoods and shrines, extending across an area that made Angkor at its height one of the largest pre-industrial cities on the planet. The temples were not isolated. They were the ceremonial cores of a metropolis so extensive that its edges had been swallowed by forest and forgotten. The archaeologist Damien Evans, one of the leaders of the initiative, described the transformation succinctly. What they had had before the scans was a scatter of disconnected points on a map. What they had after was, in effect, a detailed street plan of an entire city. Every question about the astronomical intent of the central temples now has to be asked again against this new backdrop. If Angkor Wat's alignments encoded solstice and equinox, if its galleries encoded the length of the solar year, if its towers mirrored the coils of Draco, they did so not as an isolated monument, but as the spiritual centerpiece of a living urban world, and the pattern in which the streets and reservoirs of that world were laid down is a datum we have only begun to read. The same revolution is underway over the pampa of Nazca. Since roughly 2018, teams from Yamagata University in Japan, working in collaboration with researchers at IBM, have combined high-resolution drone photogrammetry with pattern recognition software trained to look for the specific signatures of low-relief geoglyphs against the natural texture of the desert surface. What Maria Riker walked and measured over 58 years at the pace of a woman on foot with a broom, the new instruments are now surveying at the pace of a machine. The result has been the identification, in a period of only a few years, of hundreds of previously unknown figures, many of them smaller than the great animals of the classic Nazca inventory. Many of them clustered along ancient trails, many of them apparently earlier in date than the famous hummingbird and monkey. The population of figures on the pampa has swelled from around 1,000 to something approaching double that count, and the process has not stopped. Every new figure is a new datum, a new orientation to test, a new candidate for astronomical alignment or ritual pathway or trail marker. Riker's stubborn insistence that the desert had more to say than the impatient wanted to hear is being vindicated in a way she could not have imagined. At Stonehenge, the ground itself has begun to speak. In 2010 and the years that followed, a project known as the Stonehenge Hidden Landscape Project, led jointly by British and Austrian institutions, dragged ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry equipment across roughly 12 square kilometres of Salisbury Plain surrounding the famous stone circle. The subsurface data they collected, processed and rendered as maps of what lies beneath the turf, reveal that the great trilithons at the centre are only the surviving apex of an enormous ceremonial landscape. At Durrington Walls, less than 3 kilometres away, the survey identified traces of what appear to be scores of buried standing stones, or the pits in which such stones once stood, arranged in an arc so large that the popular press has taken to calling it a superhenge. Elsewhere across the plain, the instruments picked up shrines, processional ways, ritual pits, and monuments whose function has yet to be guessed. The stone circle that generations of tourists have queued to see is, on the new evidence, less a solitary temple than the surviving anchor of a sacred region whose full extent was unsuspected. Every question about the astronomical purpose of Stonehenge now sits inside a much larger question about the astronomical purpose of the landscape, of which Stonehenge is only one node, and at Göbekli Tepe the most sobering figure of all. The excavations conducted since 1995 have produced the T-pillars and the enclosures and the vulture stone and the carved animals that have astonished the world, and yet the geomagnetic surveys carried out across the site as a whole indicate that everything so far uncovered represents somewhere in the region of 5% of what lies beneath the surface of the hill. At least 16 further enclosures, and possibly more, remain buried, their pillars in place, their carvings unread, their orientations unmeasured. The oldest monumental architecture in the world, the site that has already forced a rewriting of the timeline of human civilization, is only barely open. Everything that has been argued about its astronomical content, Sweatman and Sikritzis' zodiac reading, the vulture stone's proposed encoding of a comet impact, the possibility of solstice or stellar alignments in the enclosure walls, is being argued from a keyhole view of a building whose corridors extend into darkness on every side. What is under the earth at Göbekli Tepe will, in the coming decades, either confirm or shatter a great deal of what has been said about the site, and the site is not the only one in that condition. Nabta Playa lies within the shifting sands of the Egyptian Western Desert, its full ritual landscape mapped only in part. The forests around Angkor still hide temple platforms not yet visited on the ground. The Pampa of Nazca is a very large desert, and the drones have not covered all of it. This is not a story we're hearing at its end. This is a story we're hearing while it is still being uncovered, and the tellers of it have the peculiar privilege and the peculiar responsibility of knowing that the ground beneath their feet is very likely to contradict them within their working lives. And even against this incomplete evidence, even against the tension between the rigorous and the speculative, even against the great mass of what is still buried, a pattern has begun to form that neither camp finds easy to dismiss. Certain numbers keep appearing. Certain numbers keep appearing, across sites that have no plausible route of contact, in cultures separated by oceans and by millennia, and in contexts that make it very difficult to argue that the appearance is trivial. 365, the count of days in the solar year, has been identified in the axial measurements of the central tower of Angkor Wat, where the two principal segments, expressed in the ancient cubit of Khmer construction, are reported to sum to that figure. It has been identified in the count of orientations discernible among the straight lines of the Nazca Pampa. It has been proposed, in a reading of the V-shaped carvings on one of the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, as the count of days indicated by the collected notches in what has been described as possibly the earliest lunisolar calendar in the human record, older than any comparable calendar by many millennia. 354, the count of days in a lunar year of 12 synodic months, appears in the measurements of Angkor's western entrance and in the reckoning of the Babylonian calendar. 29.5, the length of the synodic month, is embedded in the stone counts of the Irish Passage tomb at Noath, a neighbour of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. 18 6/10, the length of the lunar nodal cycle over which the moon's rising and setting points swing to their extremes and return, is famously encoded in the rectangle described by the 4 station stones of Stonehenge, whose short sides frame the major lunar standstill with an accuracy that the astronomer Alexander Thom called a terrific achievement of synthesis. These are not arbitrary numbers. They are the fundamental constants of naked eye astronomy, the quantities that any patient observer of the sky, in any latitude, over a sufficient stretch of nights and years, will eventually derive. That they should appear in the measurements of ancient monuments is, taken one at a time, unremarkable. Anyone building for the sun is going to encounter 365. Anyone building for the moon is going to encounter 29.5. What is harder to dismiss is the accumulation of them across a global inventory of sites whose builders had, on any conventional account, no way to be sharing notes. The archaeoastronomers who take these convergences seriously are not, for the most part, the flamboyant popularizers. They are the same scrupulous statistical workers who have spent their careers demanding higher standards of proof. Juan Antonio Belmonte, whose surveys of Egyptian temple orientations extend over decades, and Giulio Magli, whose comparative studies range from the Andes to the Nile to the megaliths of Europe, have been assembling the raw material for what may eventually become a formal statistical case that the numerical convergences exceed what coincidence alone would predict. Magli himself is careful. He warns repeatedly against what he calls numerical speculation, against the temptation to see meaning wherever a measurement lands near a familiar figure, against the selection effect that ensures the convergences one finds are the ones one went looking for. His caution is not a rejection of the pattern. It is a description of the discipline required to test it honestly. But if the pattern survives that testing, and the preliminary indications are that at least some elements of it do, then the implication is one that will require, in the years ahead, a reorganization of how the ancient world is understood. Not the reorganization that Hancock proposed, in which a single lost civilization ceded the astronomical knowledge of all subsequent peoples, something more subtle and more interesting. The possibility that observational astronomy, as a body of practice, is very much older than the invention of writing, that it developed independently, and perhaps also through slow diffusion, at a scale we have not properly measured in many parts of the inhabited world. That the numbers it produced were the same numbers everywhere, because the sky is the same sky everywhere, and human eyes and human patience and human stone are the same everywhere, and that the fingerprints these traditions left, in the alignments and the measurements and the counts of pillars and holes and lines, are recoverable now from the surviving monuments, if we are willing to look at them all together and count carefully what we find. The question this documentary began by asking whether the astronomical sophistication of prehistoric monuments really predates the invention of astronomy, is beginning to answer itself, not in the direction of a single dramatic revelation, but in the direction of a much older, much broader, and much more distributed human practice of watching the sky than the received chronology has been prepared to admit. The stones have been keeping the count. The count, when we finally take it, is going to be larger than we thought. There is within that larger count one entry that stands apart from the others, not because its evidence is the strongest, but because if it is right, it changes the meaning of every other entry on the list. It concerns the vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe, the same limestone pillar that was raised on any reading, before agriculture, before writing, before the wheel, before the domestication of the ox. And the claim that has attached itself to that pillar over the past several years is not merely that its carvings encode a sky, but that they encode a specific date, and that the date they encode is the date on which, in the reading of certain researchers, the world came very close to ending. The claim belongs, most publicly, to Martin Sweatman, a chemical engineer at the University of Edinburgh, and to his colleague Dimitrios Tsikritsis, whose 2017 paper in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry proposed that the animals ranged across Pillar 43 are not simply animals, they are constellations. The vulture with its outstretched wings, in their reading, corresponds to a portion of the sky we would now identify with Sagittarius. The scorpion beneath it corresponds to Scorpius. The disk above the vulture's wing corresponds in their interpretation to the sun, and the position of that sun, cradled at that particular point among those particular figures, is a position the sun occupied over the site of Göbekli Tepe, at a specific moment in the deep past. Their calculation places that moment at approximately 10,150 BCE, with an uncertainty they estimate at plus or minus 250 years. It is worth pausing on that date. 10,950 BCE is not a date drawn out of a hat. It is very close, within the margin of error, to the onset of an event that climate scientists have been reconstructing for decades, the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt and severe cooling that began around 12,900 years before the present and lasted for approximately a millennium. In the ice cores of Greenland and the sediments of European lakes and the pollen records of every continent that has been studied, the signature of the Younger Dryas is unmistakable. The world had been warming out of the last glacial maximum, and then, over what appears in the records to be a matter of decades or less, the warming reversed. Temperatures in the North Atlantic fell by as much as 10 degrees. Ice sheets that had been retreating advanced again, ecosystems reorganized, populations of megafauna already under pressure collapsed toward extinction. The world that had been becoming the world we know was, for 1,000 years, another world entirely. What caused the reversal has been debated for as long as it has been recognized. The mainstream explanation invokes fresh water, an enormous influx of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean currents that carry warmth from the tropics into the northern latitudes and tipping the climate system into a colder configuration. This explanation is supported by a substantial body of oceanographic and geological work and remains, in the standard textbooks, the leading account. A competing hypothesis, however, has been circulating within a smaller research community since the early 2000s. It proposes that the trigger for the Younger Dryas was not merely oceanographic but cosmic, that a fragmenting comet, or a series of airbursts and impacts from cometary debris, struck the northern hemisphere at the critical moment, injecting soot and dust into the atmosphere, igniting continental fires and driving the climate into its abrupt cooling. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as it is called, is not the consensus view. It has been vigorously contested by geologists and climatologists who point to the difficulty of reproducing its proposed impact markers, the inconsistencies between different lines of evidence, and the absence, until recently, of an identified crater of the right age. The debate is genuine, it is technical, and it is not settled. For a time, one candidate crater did enter the discussion. In 2018, a team working with radar and airborne surveys announced the discovery of a 31-kilometre impact structure beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland. The news was received in some quarters as a possible smoking gun for the impact hypothesis, a crater of the right size, in the right hemisphere, potentially of the right age. Sweatman and others who had been arguing for a Younger Dryas impact felt the discovery vindicated a line of research that had been treated as marginal for over a decade. But science does not always deliver the confirmations it initially promises. Subsequent dating work published in 2022 concluded that the Hiawatha impact occurred not 12 or 13,000 years ago, but approximately 58 million years ago, in the aftermath of the extinction of the dinosaurs. The crater is real, its association with the Younger Dryas is not, and the impact hypothesis, for the moment, remains without an unambiguous crater to call its own. None of that has retired the wider argument. Advocates of the hypothesis continue to point to the black mats, dark sedimentary layers containing concentrations of platinum, iridium, microspherules, and other markers they interpret as impact-related, that have been identified at sites across North America, Europe and the Levant, dating to the boundary of the Younger Dryas. Their opponents reply that these markers can be produced by processes that have nothing to do with impacts, that the sampling has been inconsistent, and that no crater confirms the picture the markers are alleged to imply. The dispute is ongoing. It is likely to remain ongoing for some time. Into this dispute, Sweatman and Sikritsis have injected an unusual kind of evidence. They have described Göbekli Tepe, in a phrase that has followed their work through both the friendly and the hostile reviews, as a smoking gun for what they call coherent catastrophism. The idea that ancient traditions of sky-watching preserve a memory of cosmic events, and that Pillar 43 is a memorial to one such event, encoded so that the survivors, and the descendants of the survivors, would know when the world had almost ended. The headless man at the base of the pillar, in their reading, is not merely a symbolic figure. He is a fallen human, a casualty, a witness, and the animals arranged above him are the sky on the day he fell. The critique of this reading is substantial, and, in the view of most working archaeologists at Göbekli Tepe, decisive. Researchers at the German Archaeological Institute, who have been excavating the site for the better part of 3 decades, have pointed out that the enclosures were modified across their long life, that pillars were moved, rearranged, added to, buried and unburied, that the site was never a static open-air observatory in the way the interpretation requires. They have questioned the identification of the animals as specific constellations, noting that the same species, vultures, scorpions, foxes, boars, cranes, appear across many pillars in many enclosures, and that reading them as a coherent star map imposes a modern astronomical grammar onto what may have been a very different symbolic language. They have questioned the statistical machinery that produces the date of 10,950 BCE, noting that once one accepts the freedom to match any animal to any constellation, the sky offers up nearly any date one wants. and they have questioned the very premise that a culture without writing, without formal astronomy, without the concept of a calendar in our sense of the word, would have chosen to memorialize a cosmic event by encoding its stellar coordinates for the benefit of descendants 10,000 years in the future. These are serious objections. They deserve to be taken seriously. The hypothesis, as it stands, is not established. It is a proposal, one that has attracted attention partly because it is dramatic, and partly because it addresses a coincidence: the near alignment of the pillar's proposed date with the onset of the Younger Dryas. That is difficult to entirely dismiss, even after the hypothesis has been criticized on every other ground. Could it be that the coincidence is accidental, and that the animals on Pillar 43 are simply animals, arranged for reasons we no longer recover? Could it be that the coincidence is real, but the causation is inverted? That the memory of a catastrophic climate transition, whatever its physical cause, was preserved in ritual iconography without any need for cometary impacts to explain the encoding? Could it be that the entire reading is a projection, a case of the modern mind, saturated in disaster narratives, finding its own preoccupations in a stone that was doing something else entirely? All of these possibilities remain open. None of them can be ruled out, and yet the underlying question the hypothesis raises, whatever one makes of its particular evidence, is a question that will not go away. If some of the world's oldest monumental architecture, and Göbekli Tepe, whatever else it is unambiguously among the world's oldest monumental architecture, was raised at a moment when the climate had convulsed, when familiar landscapes had been transformed, when species had vanished and populations had been displaced, then it is worth asking whether the impulse to build such monuments and to encode celestial patterns into them might have been intensified by trauma. Whether the practice of anchoring knowledge to stone might have been born, at least in part, from the recognition that human memory is fragile, that oral traditions can be lost within a few generations of catastrophe, and that if the sky is the only reliable calendar left, then the sky must be recorded in something more durable than speech. That thought, if one entertains it, changes the emotional register of every other site this journey has visited. The winter solstice light in the Corbelled chamber at Newgrange is no longer merely a triumph of engineering. It becomes an act of insurance against forgetting. The cattle bones at Nabta Playa, the standing stones set out on the shore of a vanished lake, become not the incidental furnishings of a pastoral cult, but the archive of a people who had learned that lakes could disappear and that the stars, at least, would still be there. The animal figures at Nazca, drawn at a scale visible only from a sky the drawers themselves could not reach, become a prayer against the day when the rains might not return. Whether or not the Younger Dryas struck by cometary impact, the Younger Dryas struck, and the human beings who came out of it, and the human beings whose descendants raised the first great stone structures within a few thousand years of its ending, were beings for whom the reliability of the sky may have carried a weight that we, in the security of our modern climate, no longer feel. That is, of course, speculation. The narrative of trauma and memorial is not proved by the presence of a coincidence in a paper by a chemical engineer. But it is not disproved either, and it points, in the direction it points, toward the question that has been gathering weight beneath every site on this itinerary. Because when the sites are considered together, Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, Nabta Playa on the Nubian pastoral fringe, Newgrange on the wet green flank of the Boyne, the henges of the Salisbury Plain, the geoglyphs of the Peruvian Pampa, the sandstone galleries of Angkor, the Inca ceremonial precincts of Cusco with their careful attention to the Pleiades, the pattern that emerges is not the pattern of a single culture, nor the pattern of a single continent, nor the pattern of a single millennium. It is the pattern of a species. And the elements of that pattern that recur most stubbornly, across the widest gulfs of geography and time, are the elements that connect to precession, the slow, 25,772-year wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the position of the celestial pole, drifts the rising point of stars against the horizon, and over the centuries silently rewrites the sky. Precession is, on any conventional history of science, the discovery of Hipparchus working in the 2nd century BCE from the star catalogues of the Babylonians and his own observations from Rhodes. It is a discovery that requires records. It requires positions recorded in one generation and compared against positions recorded in another over intervals of centuries. Within a single lifetime, the drift is essentially invisible. It amounts to slightly more than 1 degree in 72 years, less than the width of a fingertip held at arm's length against the sky. Nobody notices precession by watching the sky for a season, or a decade, or even a lifetime. It is a phenomenon whose detection is inseparable from the possession of a long baseline of accurate observation. That is why the mainstream chronology places its discovery so late. Before Hipparchus, the argument runs, no culture possessed the record-keeping infrastructure that the detection would have required, and yet, Giulio Magli, working through the orientations of Egyptian temples, has been describing patterns in which the axis of a shrine is refreshed, over centuries, in ways that appear to track the drift of the stars whose risings it was originally built to catch. Juan Belmonte, whose Atlantic and Mediterranean surveys are among the most methodologically careful in the discipline, has been documenting alignments to particular stars that would have been correct at the time of construction and are wrong today by amounts consistent with the precessional drift over the intervening millennia. Thomas Brophy's proposal at Nabta Playa, that the standing stones near the calendar circle mark the positions of Orion's belt at 2 separated epochs, is precisely a claim that the builders had access to positions from 10,000 years before their own time, and could therefore in principle compare positions across the interval and infer that the sky moves. Anthony Aveni's work in the Andes, and later researchers' investigations of the Cusco alignments to the Pleiades, have found offsets that likewise seem to demand attention to the drift. The specific reconstructions differ. The cultures involved could not, on any credible history, have been in communication, and yet in each case the researchers who have looked most carefully have arrived at the same suggestion, that the builders knew or were tracking or had inherited some form of awareness that the sky's positions were not fixed. The consensus this forms is not yet a consensus in the ordinary academic sense. It has not been ratified by textbooks. It is not taught in undergraduate courses. Magli himself, in his more cautious writings, describes the identification of pre-Hipparchan precession tracking as a hypothesis whose confirmation would be, in his phrase, important for a wide interdisciplinary area of sciences ranging from archaeoastronomy to social historical research, a formulation that acknowledges the stakes without claiming victory. The evidence is uneven. Some sites present it more strongly than others. Some of the strongest cases rest on statistical arguments whose robustness will require further testing. The discipline is doing what disciplines do when a large claim begins to accumulate small pieces of support. It is proceeding carefully, testing, publishing, disputing, refining. But the pieces are accumulating, and the question they pose in their accumulation is the question this documentary has been circling from its first minutes. Did human beings, in 7 or more independent cultural traditions separated by continents and millennia, discover the same 25,772-year cycle each on their own, out of the same patient watching, and the same accumulated record and the same capacity to notice that the star that once rose at a certain angle now rises at a slightly different one? Or did they inherit it from a common source we have not yet identified, deep enough in the past that the cultures we can trace all descend from it, and diffuse enough in its transmission that we cannot recover its original shape? The answer, if there is one, is unlikely to be tidy. It is likely to be some of both. It is likely to involve independent discovery in some places, cultural transmission along routes we have underestimated in others, and the sheer stability of the sky's fundamental parameters underwriting a convergence that would look, from any single site, like a puzzle, and looks from all of them together like a signal. What it is not going to be, in the direction the evidence is currently pushing, is the answer the received chronology has been giving. That observational astronomy proper began with the Greeks and the Babylonians, that everything before them was religion rather than science, and that the numerical patterns preserved in prehistoric monuments are the accidents of superstition rather than the residue of measurement. That answer is becoming, quietly and cumulatively, harder to sustain, which returns us at last to the question the whole journey has been posing beneath its surface question, not what the monuments encode, but who the people were who encoded it, not what they knew, but what kind of minds they had. The paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer, whose work on the emergence of anatomically and behaviourally modern humans is among the most cited in the field, has been arguing for decades that the cognitive equipment required for symbolic representation, long-term planning, and abstract pattern recognition was in place among Homo sapiens at least 100,000 years ago, and probably rather earlier. The archaeological signatures of that equipment, the pigments, the beads, the incised ochre from Blombos Cave, the engraved ostrich eggshells from Deep Kloof, the burials with grave goods, the sustained production of standardized tools across generations, appear across the African record long before the last glacial maximum, long before agriculture, long before the earliest stone circles at Göbekli Tepe. The capacity to notice that the sky moves, to remember its positions, to represent them in a durable medium, and to teach the representation to a successor generation is not a late acquisition of civilization. It is a birthright of the species. What changed, in the millennia between roughly 10,000 and 3000 BCE, was not the wiring of the mind. It was the organization of the community. Communities that had previously used their cognitive equipment for hunting and gathering, and the maintenance of oral tradition began, in scattered places around the inhabited world, to invest that equipment into projects whose scale exceeded the lifespan of any individual builder. A calendar circle in the Nubian desert, watched and rebuilt across generations. A passage tomb on an Irish river, whose corbelled roof and precisely angled roof box required the coordinated labour of a population of hundreds, sustained over years, motivated by a purpose that outlived any single motivator. A ring of pillars on a Turkish hill, raised so early that the very existence of villages capable of raising it forces the rewriting of the story of how humans came to build. These were not the acts of primitives whose achievements astonish us because we had underestimated them. They were the acts of scientists. The word is not too strong. What defines a scientist is not the possession of laboratory equipment, or the use of a formal notation, or membership in an institution recognizable by our present criteria. What defines a scientist is the discipline of observing the world carefully, recording what is observed, comparing observations across time, drawing inferences from the comparisons, and transmitting the inferences to others who will test them further. Every one of those practices is attested in different forms at every site this journey has visited. The observers at Newgrange watched the winter sun for enough winters to know the exact stone at which its light would enter their chamber. The observers at Nabta Playa marked the rising points of stars they had watched for enough generations to trust the marking. The observers at Nazca inscribed the ground with lines they oriented, in some part, to the risings of the Pleiades they had catalogued in their memories and their ceremonies. The observers at Göbekli Tepe raised pillars in configurations that, whatever their precise astronomical content, presuppose a sustained attention to what the sky does. Their laboratories were open air. Their notation was carved stone, painted ceramic oral verse. Their peer review was the winter that either did or did not arrive when the marker had predicted it. Their publications were structures visible from horizons their authors had walked with their own feet. That the products of that science look to us like religion is not evidence against its being science. It is evidence that in the deep past the separation we now make between the observation of nature and the veneration of nature had not yet occurred, and did not need to occur, and might, from a certain angle, be less obvious than we currently take it to be. The astronomers who built Newgrange did not need to distinguish between recording the solstice and celebrating it. The recording was the celebration was the recording. The stone was the instrument, the archive, the temple, and the classroom in a single indivisible act. And the people who did this were us, not our ancestors in some diminished form, not proto-humans whose achievements deserve the condescending admiration we sometimes extend to them. Us, beings with our brains, our capacity for boredom and for patience, our vulnerability to weather and grief and hope, our tendency to look up at the sky when we don't know what else to do, our need to tell our children what our parents told us, our willingness to spend the labour of a lifetime on a structure whose purpose we may not live to see fulfilled. What separates us from them is not intelligence. It is the accident of the era into which each of us happened to be born. They were born into a world that required them to write in stone. We were born into a world that has mostly forgotten how to read what they wrote. The reading is beginning, slowly, to be recovered. The recovery is the work this documentary has been describing. It has been slow. It has been contested. It has been beset in equal measure by the credulity of enthusiasts and by the resistance of guardians. and it has advanced in spite of both through the patient labour of researchers whose names appear in journals more often than in headlines. What they are recovering when it is fully assembled is not going to be a lost civilization. It is going to be, in a way that is stranger and more moving than any lost civilization would have been, the earliest chapters of our own. And those chapters are not closed. They have never been closed. That is the point most easily missed. In the long shuffle from Newgrange to Göbekli Tepe, to Nabta Playa to Nazca to Angkor to Cusco, the point that all the arguments about dating and alignment and statistical significance tend to obscure. The tradition whose first pages are carved into these stones did not end when the stones were abandoned. It did not end when the last priest of the calendar circle walked away from the pillars at Nabta Playa. It did not end when Göbekli Tepe was deliberately covered, nor when the Nazca lines were left to the wind, nor when the Inca Empire fell and its Coricancha was rebuilt into the foundations of a colonial church. The observers went on observing. The knowledge went on being transmitted. Only the medium changed. In many parts of the world, the medium never changed at all. Consider the sea. Consider the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific, 3,000 kilometers from one speck of land to the next, a surface offering no roads, no landmarks, no horizons of anything but water and cloud, and consider that human beings crossed it, deliberately, in both directions, in vessels of wood and cord, guided by nothing that could be pointed at except the sky. The Polynesian navigators who accomplished this were not lucky, and they were not, in the sense the word usually implies, primitive. They were the inheritors of an observational tradition, as sophisticated in its own terms as anything preserved in stone in Ireland or Egypt. Their instrument was a star compass, held in the mind, dividing the horizon into houses, each house a section of sky in which specific stars rose and set at specific times of year, each house a bearing that could be steered by if you knew which star to follow and when to change from that star to the next as it climbed too high and yielded to another. To learn this compass was the labour of a life. To use it was the labour of a voyage. The Maori who reached the islands they named Aotearoa carried this knowledge with them across water no European vessel would successfully cross for another 500 years, and they carried it not in books but in songs, and in the memory of navigators trained from childhood, in the sequences of stars along the paths their ancestors had already sailed. The stars were the pages, the horizon was the binding, the recitation of the route was the reading aloud. This tradition was not a curiosity, it was a working technology, and it survived, in fragments, into the modern era, and it has in the last half-century been painstakingly reconstructed by voyagers and scholars determined that it should not be lost. Canoes have been built to old specifications. Voyages have been made without instruments. The routes have been walked again in water. What was recovered was not a museum piece, but a practice, and the practice, once revived, worked. The stars had not moved. The knowledge of how to read them had only gone quiet. It had not been extinguished. Turn from the ocean to the mountains, and the same continuity reveals itself in a different form. In the high Andes of Peru and Bolivia, on the terraced slopes where potatoes have been grown for longer than any European empire has existed, farmers still look, in the last weeks of June, at a particular patch of sky just before dawn. What they are looking for is the Pleiades. What they are reading is the brightness. If the cluster appears sharp and clear, the coming season will bring reliable rain, and the planting can proceed on the usual schedule. If the cluster appears dim, blurred, veiled by something the eye can barely name, the rains will be late or scarce, and the planting must be delayed, and the varieties chosen must be those that tolerate a harder year. This is not folklore in the dismissive sense the word sometimes carries. It is a forecasting method, and researchers who have set it against the modern climate record have found that it works. The blurring the farmers see corresponds, it turns out, to a thin layer of high cirrus cloud, generated during El Niño years, the same El Niño whose disruptions of Pacific weather will indeed reduce the coming Andean rains. The Pleiades, in other words, are not causing the drought. They are, through the accident of altitude and the mechanics of atmosphere, revealing its approach. The farmers do not need to know why the method works to know that it does. They have been testing it, one growing season at a time, for a length of time no one can precisely measure, and they have kept using it because it has kept being right. The same cluster that governed the trapezoids of Nazca, that anchored the Inca Sec system radiating from the Coricancha in Cusco, that appears as the Seven Sisters in stories told from Greece, to the Northern Territory of Australia, still governs, in a working sense, the calendar of communities in the mountains above those valleys. The observation did not stop when the observatories fell. It moved into the fields and the seed potatoes and the mouths of the farmers who told their children, as their parents had told them, what to look for in the cold air of the winter dawn. Move again, this time to the far north of Australia, to the coastal country of Arnhem Land, and the continuity acquires a further dimension. The young people of that country hold an astronomical tradition that has been maintained without interruption for a length of time that is genuinely difficult for outsiders to grasp. Their stars are not decorative, their stars carry lore. The constellation an outsider would call Orion is, in their tradition, a canoe, and the 3 stars we call the belt are 3 brothers in that canoe, and the story of what those brothers did and what they were not permitted to do and what happened when they broke the permission is a story that encodes ethical instruction to be transmitted to the young. The Pleiades, again, appear in the same sky, and again they mark seasons, and again they are integrated with the social calendar of a people whose ancestors have been reading this sky from this latitude for a period of time that overlaps, at its deep end, with the earliest habitation of the continent by human beings. What has begun to happen over the last few decades is that researchers working with young elders and with elders from other Aboriginal Australian communities have begun to cross-reference these oral traditions against the modern astronomical record, and they have begun to find in the stories precise observational content, descriptions of eclipse behaviour, descriptions of the variability of certain stars, descriptions of the connections between tidal patterns and lunar phases that appear in the songs earlier than they appear in the published European science. Whether every claim of this kind will survive scrutiny is a matter still under debate. That some of them will survive is no longer in serious doubt. A tradition preserved orally for tens of thousands of years, turns out, when finally examined by outsiders, to contain data. The ancestors were not merely telling stories about the sky, they were, in the telling, keeping records. And then, in the modern nation whose southern islands the Maori navigators reached at the end of their long voyages, the tradition has recently taken a public form of a kind that would have been almost unimaginable a generation ago. In 2022, the government of New Zealand established a new public holiday. The date shifts from year to year because it is tied not to the Gregorian calendar, but to the sky, to the winter heliacal rising of the Pleiades. Matariki, in the Maori language, the same cluster the Andean farmers still watch, and the Greeks called the Seven Sisters, and the Yolngu know by another name entirely. On the morning the cluster reappears above the horizon before dawn, having spent its weeks of invisibility below the sun, a nation formally pauses. Families gather. The names of those who have died in the past year are spoken to the stars. The coming year is set in motion by an observation made with the naked eye at a moment specified by the sky itself. It is not formally a religious holiday. It is not formally a scientific holiday. It is the reintegration, at the level of national life, of a practice that had never actually stopped being practiced but had, for a long time, been practiced without official recognition. The recognition is the news. The practice is not. The practice has been continuous. It only became visible again to the wider society when the wider society at last permitted itself to see it. Take these threads together, the navigators, the farmers, the elders, the reinstated holiday, and something clarifies about the entire journey the earlier hours of this documentary have traced. The stones are not the tradition. The stones are what remains of the tradition in the places where the tradition, as a living practice, was broken. Where the practice survived, no stone was needed, because the sky itself was enough, and the songs were enough, and the annual return of the observation was enough. Newgrange endures because the community that built it did not endure. Göbekli Tepe endures because the world that built it went, in a way we still do not fully understand, silent. The Nazca lines endure in part because the desert erases nothing, and in part because the culture that inscribed them no longer walks the pampa in the numbers required to keep the sky knowledge oral. Where the oral did survive, as in the Pacific, as in the Andes, as in Arnhem Land, the record is not in stone. The record is in the living voice, and in the living eye, and in the continued arrival of the right star at the right point of the horizon, on the right morning of the year, watched by someone who was taught to watch it, by someone who was taught to watch it, by someone whose teachers, if the chain could be followed backwards far enough, would eventually be found standing beside the builders of the monuments themselves. This science of the sky, in other words, never stopped. It only changed its medium in the places where it had to. Where it did not have to, it stayed exactly what it had always been. A person, looking up, telling the next person what they had seen. And so the journey returns at last to the place where it began, beyond the small door in the hillside above the river Boyne, down the passage that narrows and turns and drops slightly as it burrows into the mound, past the great orthostats with their spirals and their lozenges and their inscriptions in a language no one has translated, into the cruciform chamber where the corbelled roof rises to its 6-metre point above your head, and the 3 recesses open to the sides and the basin stones sit on the floor as they have sat since before the pyramids were dreamed. In the dark of that chamber, on the morning of the winter solstice, in the 17 minutes when the beam arrives, everything the earlier hours of this documentary have argued becomes briefly unnecessary. The argument becomes the light. Consider what has to be true for the light to arrive. The sun, 93 million miles away, has to have kept for 5,200 years the same relationship to the Earth's tilted axis that it had on the morning O'Kelly stood in the chamber in 1967, and on the morning the builders stood in the chamber sometime before 3000 BCE, and on every morning of every winter solstice in between. It has kept that relationship. It has kept it because the physical laws that govern it are the physical laws that governed it then, and there is no reason within the physics for the appointment to be missed. But the appointment being kept by the sun is only half of what has to be true. The other half is that the aperture the builders cut into the roof above the entrance has to still be there, in the shape they cut it, oriented to the angle they oriented it, at the height they set it, and the passage has to still slope as they set it to slope, and the chamber has to still stand as they built it to stand, roof unmortared and watertight and uncollapsed after all this time. If any of those conditions had failed, the beam would not arrive. None of those conditions has failed. The builders built well enough that more than 5 millennia after their deaths, their machine still works. That is what should be sat with in the 17 minutes. Not the technical achievement, though the technical achievement is astonishing. Not the astronomical precision, though the astronomical precision is exact. What should be sat with is the intention. Someone, in the era before writing, before cities, before the invention of the plough that would eventually reshape the country whose river Boyne runs through it, decided that a message would be sent. The message was not primarily information. Information can be sent by many means, and much of the information the builders possessed did not in fact survive the collapse of their world. What survived was something more specific. What survived was the fact that they had understood the sun well enough to make it, at a moment of their choosing, arrive at a wall of their choosing, for a duration of their choosing, in a manner no accident of geology or weather could have produced. The fact of the understanding is the message. The message is, we were here. The message is, we knew enough to do this. The message is, we made it in such a way that you would receive it, whoever you are, standing where we intended you to stand, at the hour we intended you to stand there, in a year we could not name because we did not yet know how to name years but could reach across by this device, as certainly as if we had. The same message is written into the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, whatever the specific astronomical content of those pillars finally proves to be. The same message is written into the megaliths at Nabta Playa, whether or not their alignments will withstand every challenge that has been brought against them. The same message is inscribed on the pampa at Nazca. The same message is embedded in the eastward orientation of the great temple at Angkor. The same message is preserved in the CK lines radiating from the Coricancha at Cusco toward the horizons where the Pleiades emerge from the sun's glare to signal the coming of the growing year. In each place the vocabulary is different. In each place the materials are different. In each place the specific content, if content can be distinguished from carrier, is different. What is the same is the underlying act. The act of noticing something about the sky. The act of caring enough about what was noticed to build it into a structure. The act of building the structure in such a way that the structure would outlast the noticer, and outlast the noticer's grandchildren, and outlast the language in which the noticing had first been described, and reach forward to a person who would recognize, at the moment of reception, that a message had been sent. The message is proof of presence. It is not information about a lost civilization. It is not evidence of a superior science extinguished by catastrophe. It is not a signal from anywhere but here, from anyone but us, from any moment but the many moments when human beings looked up and decided that what they had seen mattered enough to be recorded in the most permanent medium available to them, that the medium was stone, that the recording was oriented to the sky, that the recording still works. The documentary ends here, in the chamber, in the 17 minutes, because the 17 minutes are the answer that is more durable than any of the answers the earlier hours failed to arrive at. Did an unknown civilization seed astronomical knowledge across the prehistoric world? The evidence, honestly weighed, does not support that claim, and the honest researchers who have looked hardest for such a civilization have not so far found it. Did the builders of these monuments know more than the conventional chronology has traditionally credited them with knowing? The evidence, honestly weighed, increasingly indicates that they did. Did they possess a technology comparable to ours? They did not. Did they possess an attentiveness comparable to ours? They possessed, in many cases, an attentiveness superior to ours. They were watching. We, for the most part, are not. To stand in the chamber at Newgrange in the light of the arriving beam is to feel, for the length of the beam's duration, that the gap between them and us is smaller than the intervening centuries would suggest. The sun has not changed. The stone has not changed. What the light does when it reaches the wall has not changed. What has changed is that the builders are absent, and that we are the ones now standing where they intended someone to stand, and that the appointment has been kept, from their side of the passage, without failure, and it is now the question of what we will do with the fact of its keeping. That question does not have an answer this documentary can provide. It has, at most, a shape. The shape is the shape of a human being, standing in the near dark, waiting for a light that has been on its way for a very long time. The waiting is the practice. The practice is what has continued in the fields of the Andes and on the ocean routes of the Pacific, and beneath the winter skies of Arnhem Land, and on the dawn of Matariki in a country the builders of Newgrange never knew existed. The practice is the science before it was called science, and the reverence before it was distinguished from the science, and the record before the record was written down, and the transmission before the transmission was formalized into curricula and papers and instruments. The practice is only the act of looking up. It is only the act of noticing. It is only the act of caring enough about what has been noticed to make sure that someone else will notice it too. The beam moves slowly along the floor of the chamber. It touches the back wall. It illuminates, for a few minutes, the triple spiral carved into the stone by hands whose owners had names none of us will ever hear. It withdraws. The chamber returns to darkness. Outside, the sun continues to rise over the valley of the Boyne, and the birds go on with their mourning as they have for 5,000 winters, and the door in the hillside stands where the builders left it, and the appointment, having been kept, is set for the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that, indefinitely, as long as the sun endures and the stone endures, and someone, somewhere, remembers to come. They built it so that you would come. You are here. Look up.